The stone won't fall until the podcast of the dragon comes to your device. Hey everybody, my name is Morgan. Rest in peace to the Grey Warder on Twitter and Discord. Welcome to the 36th episode of Podcast of the Dragon. Did you think I was going to finish The Shadow Rising without following Rand through the columns? Not a chance. In this episode, I explore Aiel identity, examine their effect on wetlander culture, draw uncomfortable parallels with my own, and, oh yeah, talk about a trip through a weird-ass interactive museum/modern art piece. Robert Jordan took inspiration from several different cultures in building the Aiel, blending them so as to make a unique society. Where they come from, how they got there, and the rules that bind them make their evolution as a people truly singular. The Aiel are one of a kind when it comes to who they are, which is one reason I think they're so well loved. They have an endearing novelty and strangeness. But when it comes to their journey of identity and where they go, I find them intimately familiar, for they are so very American. Their culture is built on lies. People in the United States grow up learning a whitewashed history that is predicated on the idea that we as a people can do no wrong, and that every choice that we as a country make is pure and right. Every bomb we drop is justified. The enemies that we are taught to hate as kids, we hate without giving too much thought as to why. If you substitute the buzzword of honor with freedom, there's a similar amorphous concept that drives and sustains us as a people. And while the U.S. has a very diverse culture and the motivations of its people are actually quite complicated, the two-party system that we operate under gives me the comfort to be shamelessly reductionist. So I can say that what I have noticed growing up through the 80s and 90s in the United States is that as you are raised through the public school system, you drink in this whitewashed, perfect narrative of America, because we are legitimately told this is the greatest country in the world. We are the best. Our history is portrayed to us as something with mostly pure intentions, and what attention is paid to the bad stuff like slavery and racial inequality is done so with the idea that it's not like that anymore. And if you are a white American and privileged in such a way that your lived experience doesn't teach you any different, you have no reason not to believe it. And at some point, you as a citizen get to the age where if you employ critical thinking skills and empathy, you come to realize that it's bullshit. The bombs that we drop are rarely justified. The whole system is designed to perpetuate racial inequality, and nothing we do as a country is perfect or flawless or right, because no individual one person is perfect or flawless or right, and a country is just a grouping of people together, ergo there is no such thing as a country that can do no wrong. And the greatest country in the world narrative that Americans feed to their children and feed to each other is this toxic bullshit of exceptionalism and lies. And so the truth of that, once I realized it, once I thought my way out, made me bitter and angry and resentful, and embarrassed too, to think of how people in the rest of the world must look at us and just be outraged at the foolishness and stupidity of Americans to think themselves so much better than everyone else, and to tell themselves that they are so very great, when if you give it the smallest amount of thought, it's easy to see that it's ludicrous. So there are Americans like me who grow up and realize and accept that their culture's narrative is an utter lie. And then there are those who refuse to accept it, who drive jacked-up trucks with flags mounted on them, peppered with pro-Second Amendment stickers, and will never accept that our country is anything but good and perfect. So I find the journey of the Aiel and their struggle to accept themselves so easy to spot in my own country's journey, right down to an entire clan legitimizing the choice to ignore truth and embrace lies, to choose schism over unity, and to embrace the words of a loudmouth shouting fake news because it is easier and less painful than accepting an unpleasant outcome or a change in identity or the knowledge that the national origin you're so proud of is rooted in something that's shameful. So the journey that they go through is so very, very American, because it seems like any American ends up being faced with a choice of, do you accept the truth that the narrative of the greatness of your nation is a lie, or do you absolutely refuse? And in the people who can't accept RJ explores in the Aiel what happens when someone betrays their culture and their honor, and everything breaks down and degrades because they can't work past their cognitive dissonance. The Aiel as a culture are central to the Wheel of Time in a way that no other culture or country or nationality is, because their people are the linchpin that connects the past to the present. If a people as a whole could be Ta'veren, they would be. Their circumstances play out over 3,000 plus years to connect the threads so that the dragon in his time can come again. They are a human manifestation of the turning of the wheel, an age coming again. And by the time it comes back around, the legend and the myth and the story of them is long forgotten, and so far from what they know themselves to be, that many cannot handle its reveal. From the start, in the Eye of the World, as he is giving lore drops and doing world building, Jordan is making certain to emphasize this people, the Aiel, or this place, the Aiel Waste. He stresses lots of things with repeat mentions to provide foreshadowing and highlight importance, but there are twice as many references to Aiel in Book 1, Aiel or Aielman or the Waste, as there are of Arthur Hawkwing, over 40 mentions of them. It's not just that RJ is making sure we, the reader, are so familiar with the term that from the beginning Aiel goes with Wheel of Time like butter goes with bread, but he's ensuring that it's apparent that our main characters have grown up hearing of them, and that they've been part of the backdrop of their youth. Everybody grows up with some big event in recent history that colors the dialogue around them. Even in isolation, RJ actually explores how microcosms like small villages will talk about unusual events for years, events that wouldn't even be worth noticing if you were from a city. But often people grow up where something has happened that they cannot quite grasp because they were too young or it happened just before they were born. I was born just a few years after both the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, and both of those things were constantly discussed when I was young. They marked the culture that I was raised in, even though I didn't understand what they were until much later on. Jordan has his characters grow up post-Aiel War in much the same way I grew up post-Vietnam, and everyone talks about it just as everybody talked about it when I grew up, and it saturates the culture with metaphoric reminders, just as any seedy political scandal, any scandal at all really, ends in gate today. That's been a part of the national symbology for my entire life. And in a similar way, I can joke that technically the Aiel War was a police action, and if you were old enough or versed enough in historical references, you know that I'm making a wisecrack about Vietnam. RJ mentions the Aiel and the Waste 5 times before the Trollocs attack on Winter Night. First in Chapter 3, as Padan Fain is beginning to spin out his tale of troubles being everywhere, and he makes sure to describe the length and breadth of the known world, from the Great Blight south to the Sea of Storms, from the Arth Ocean in the west to the Aiel Waste in the east. RJ uses him to give us a verbal sketch of the map, and then in the next chapter, Tom Maryland casually comments that Rand is as tall as an Aielman, which marks that they have a distinct type of physicality, and is the first of several times in the Eye of the World that Jordan has characters point out our dragon's heritage. And then, as an audience is starting to gather, Tom is like, okay, well, I better start performing for the crowd to give you a preview of what you're going to get at your festival. Tom starts juggling, and he says, "You want stories?" Tom Maryland declaimed. "I have stories, and I will give them to you. I will make them come alive before your eyes." A blue ball joined the others from somewhere, and a green one and a yellow. "Tales of great wars and great heroes for the men and boys. For the women and girls, the entire Aptaragine cycle. Tales of Arthur Ter'angreal, Arthur Hawkwing, Arthur the High King who once ruled all the lands from the Aiel Waste to the Arth Ocean and even beyond. Wondrous stories of strange people and strange lands, of the Green Man, of warders and Trollocs, of Ogier and Aiel, the 1,000 tales of Anla the wise counselor, Jaime the giant slayer, how Susa tamed Jane Farstrader, Mara and the 3 foolish kings." So, we get geography first from Fain, and then Tom once again kind of gives us a lay of the land, so to speak. We see that there are a specific people that live in this place called the Waste, and he's lumping them in with warders and Trollocs and Ogiers, so we can see that they're considered exotic, just in case the knowledge that they live in a place called the Waste didn't make them seem exotic enough. And then, We get our first idea of their reputation a bit later on from Master Alvear, when some of the village council members are talking, and Master Alvear gets so mad at Sen Bui for being shitty about Nynaeve and just generally being a wanker, that he tells him to shut up, and it's basically like, stop being a black-veiled Aiel, which lets the reader know that they're considered unpleasant or unfriendly or hostile. Tam's fever dream that he has as Rand is dragging him through the woods trying to get him to Emond's Field for healing never specifically mentions Aiel. RJ is setting up a mystery as to Rand's parenting and heritage, and also as to Tam's backstory, and so we don't get specific details. We get, "They came over the dragon wall like a flood," Tam said suddenly in a strong, angry voice, "and washed the land with blood. How many died for Layman's sin?" And, later on, "They called them savages," Tam said urgently. "The fools said they could be swept aside like rubbish. How many battles lost, how many cities burned before they faced the truth, before the nation stood together against them." He loosed his hold on Rand, and sadness filled his voice. "The field at Marath carpeted with the dead, and no sound but the cries of ravens and the buzzing of flies. The topless towers of Cairhien burning in the night like torches. All the way to the shining walls they burned and slew before they were turned back." And Rand gets him to be quiet because he hears the Trollocs marching on their way back from Emond's Field, so Tam shuts up for a while, and then it says, "After a time, Tam spoke up again. Avendasora. It said it makes no seed, but they brought a cutting to Cairhien, a sapling, a royal gift of wonder for the king." Though he sounded angry, he was barely loud enough for Rand to understand. Anyone who could hear him would be able to hear the litter scraping across the ground, too. Rand kept on, only half listening. "They never make peace, never, but they brought a sapling as a sign of peace. 500 years it grew, 500 years of peace with those who make no peace with strangers. Why did he cut it down? Why? Blood was the price for Avendora Ladera, blood the price for Layman's pride." And then Tam continues mumbling something about how their women fight alongside the men, and "oh, I found this baby." And while all of this is very mysterious, and nothing about it says Aiel, once you get the first mention of the Aiel War, which is in Chapter 25, called The Traveling People, RJ gives us a fuck ton of cultural information about the Aiel, and that allows for the lines to start being drawn. Rayan, the Seeker of the Tuatha'an, asks Elias if he can tell him a story, the story that they hear about Sightblinder wanting to blind the eye of the world. It says, "It begins in the spring 2 years ago with a band of the people who were crossing the waste by the northern route." Heron's eyes shot open. The waste? The Aiel waste? They were crossing the Aiel waste. "Some people can enter the waste without being bothered," Elias said. "Gleemen, peddlers if they're honest. The Tuathan crossed the waste all the time. Merchants from Cairhien used to before the tree in the Aiel War." "The Aiel men avoid us," Rayan said sadly, "though many of us have tried to speak with them. They watch us from a distance, but they will not come near us, nor let us come near them. Sometimes I worry that they might know the song, though I suppose it isn't likely. Among Aiel men do not sing, you know. Isn't that strange? From the time an Aiel boy becomes a man, he will not sing anything but battle chants or their dirge for the slain. I have heard them singing over their dead and over those they have killed. That song is one to make the stones weep." Isla, listening, nodded agreement over her knitting. Perrin did some quick rethinking. He had thought the Tinkers must be afraid all the time with all this talk of running away, but no one who was afraid would even think of crossing the Aiel waste. From what he had heard, no one who was sane would try crossing the waste. "If this is some story about a song," Elias began, but Rayan shook his head. "No, my old friend, not a song. I am not sure I know what it is about." He turned his attention to Perrin. "Young Aiel often travel into the Blight. Some of the young men go alone, thinking for some reason that they have been called to kill the Dark One. Most go in small groups to hunt Trollocs." Rayan shook his head sadly, and when he went on, his voice was heavy. 2 years ago, a band of the people crossing the waste about 100 miles south of the Blight found one of these groups. Young women, Isla put in as sorrowful as her husband, little more than girls. Perrin made a surprised sound, and Elias grinned at him wryly. "Aiel girls don't have to tend a house and cook if they don't want to, boy. The ones who want to be warriors instead join one of the warrior societies, Farderais Mai, the Maidens of the Spear, and fight right alongside the men." Perrin shook his head. Elias chuckled at his expression. Rayan took up the story again, distaste and perplexity mingled in his voice. "The young women were all dead except one, and she was dying. She crawled to the wagons. It was clear she knew they were Tuatha'an. Her loathing outweighed her pain, but she had a message so important to her that she must pass it on to someone, even us, before she died. Men went to see if they could help any of the others. There was a trail of her blood to follow, but all were dead, and so were 3 times their number in Trollocs. Elias sat up, his pipe almost falling from between his teeth. 100 miles into the waste? Impossible. Djevik Kashar, that's what Trollocs call the waste, the dying ground. They wouldn't go 100 miles into the waste if all the Myrtle and the Blight were driving them. So, this is chock full of great information. My wife, who unfortunately kind of petered out on reading this book, which made me a little bit sad, but, what are you going to do? She was reading this and constantly going back and forth, and so she immediately flipped back to Tam having his fever dreams and concluded that Tam must be talking about this same tree, and as they go further on, and they're talking about how this maiden is saying Leaf Blighter means to slay the eye of the world, lost one, she was like, I wonder if the Tinkers and the Aiel have some kind of connection or a similar origin story. And I was just kind of like, that's an interesting theory. But this bit of the story here tells us so much about Aiel warrior prowess. Hearing Trollocs fear Aiel, Trollocs would never go so far into the waste because they call this land where these people live the dying ground? That right there is a beautiful example of showing, not telling. We've just met Trollocs fairly recently. Our main characters have been running from Trollocs. They've all had horrifying experiences with them where they've been powerless and only the one power seemed to stop them, and Lon, who's basically a machine. But here are people in this world that Trollocs are afraid of, and that does something special to build the basis for expectations for Aiel. Not just expectations that we the reader have, but the expectations that our characters will have before they meet Aiel. We learn that women are warriors, that the Aiel specifically hate Tinkers, and getting the bit about Cairhien and the tree sets up the lore drop that we get from Alman Bunt as he drives Rand and Mat the last leg of the trip to Camelin, talking all the way. He's telling them about Tigraine's disappearance, and it says, "There's some saying she's still alive, that Morghese isn't the rightful queen. Bloody fools. I remember what happened, remember like it was yesterday. No daughter heir to take the throne when the old queen died, and every house in Andor scheming and fighting for the right. And ter'angreal Damadred, you wouldn't have thought he'd lost his wife, him hot to figure which house would win so he could marry again and become prince consort after all. Well, he managed it, though why Morghese chose... no man knows the mind of a woman, and a queen is twice a woman, wed to a man, wed to the land. He got what he wanted anyway, if not the way he wanted it. Brought Cairhien into the plotting before he was done, and you know how that ended. The tree chopped down and black-veiled Aiel coming over the dragon wall. So, RJ in the first book makes us familiar with other people's feelings of Aiel as this savage and inexorable force, as our main characters are moving out into the world and actually beginning to learn the history of the Aiel War and the impact that it's had over the past 2 decades. And then we move into the Great Hunt, where for the first time we actually meet an Aiel. But before that happens, RJ gives us a bit more information for our preconceptions. First, he reinforces what we already know when Moiraine and Swan and Varen are telling Rand that he's the Dragon Reborn. Moiraine says, "Nearly 20 years ago the Aiel crossed the spine of the world, the Dragon Wall, the only time they have ever done so. They ravaged through Cairhien, destroyed every army sent against them, burned the city of Cairhien itself, and fought all the way to Tar Valon. It was winter and snowing, but cold or heat mean little to an Aiel. The final battle, the last that counted, was fought outside the Shining Walls in the shadow of Dragonmount. In 3 days and 3 nights of fighting, the Aiel were turned back. Or rather, they turned back, for they had done what they came to do, which was to kill King Laman of Cairhien for his sin against the tree." And this is great language here. The choice of the words ravaged, destroyed, burned, they sound brutal and savage. It's beginning to make sense that black-veiled Aiel is used as a metaphor when someone's being a dick. But then the hunt for the horn begins, and we get Massema's assault with the stew. Massema throws hot stew on Rand, and Rand goes to eat with Ingtar and Loyal and Mat and Perrin, and he's like, "I wish I knew what Massema's problem is," and it starts a conversation, because Ingtar is like, "Yeah, Moiraine and Lon want to say you're from the Two Rivers, but Massema was stationed in the Eastern Marches for years, and who knows whether Massema is just garden variety racist against Aiel because he spent a lot of time fighting them, or whether he actually had a really impactful experience with one that makes his hatred a response to trauma and therefore more understandable. But not very understandable, because having a stress response to someone with red hair can't be controlled, but the choice to throw stew on them certainly can. Anyway, Ingtar gives a lot more information about Aiel. As Matt and parents say, yeah, Rand's from the Two Rivers, Loyal confirms that he has the look. He's got a book. Remember, Rand, I told you about till shade is gone, till water is gone, spitting in Sightblinder's eye on the last day? And it says, what was that? Matt asked. About spitting in the Dark One's eye. That is how long the Aiel say they'll fight, Ingtar said, and I don't doubt they will. Except for peddlers and gleemen, Aiel divide the world in two, Aiel and enemies. They changed that for Cairhien 500 years ago for some reason no one but an Aiel could understand, but I do not think they will ever do so again. I suppose not, Loyal sighed, but they do let the Tuatha on, the traveling people, cross the waste, and they don't see Ogier as enemies either, though I doubt any of us would want to go out into the waste. Aiel come to Steading Shanghai sometimes to trade for Sung wood, a hard people, though. Ingtar nodded. I wish I had some as hard, half as hard. Is that a joke? Matt laughed. If I ran a mile wearing all the iron you're wearing, I would fall down and sleep a week. You've done it mile after mile all day. Aiel are hard, Ingtar said, man and woman hard. I've fought them, and I know. They will run 50 miles and fight a battle at the end of it, their death walking with any weapon or none, except a sword. They will not touch a sword for some reason, or ride a horse, not that they need to. If you have a sword and the Aielman has his bare hands, it is an even fight if you're good. They herd cattle and goats where you or I would die of thirst before the day was done. They dig their villages into huge rock spires out in the waste. They've been there since the breaking, near enough. Arthur Hawkwing tried to dig them out and was bloodied, the only major defeats he ever suffered. By day the heat in the Aiel waste shimmers with heat, and by night it freezes. And an Aiel will give you that blue-eyed stare and tell you there is no place on earth he would rather be. He won't be lying, either. If they ever tried to come out, we would be hard-pressed to stop them. The Aiel War lasted 3 years, and that was only 4 out of 13 clans. So Ingtar is giving a ton of really good information and just a casual talk. Unless in the Eastern Marches, where Shinerans and Aiel clash, you actually can see Aiel houses, I'm going to assume that Ingtar has second-hand information, that he's discussed the Aiel with someone who has been into the waste and actually seen an Aiel hold and described them to him as Pueblo-style cliff dwellings. If I had to guess, I'd say it was a gleeman, because a gleeman is far more likely to be invited beneath someone's roof and treated like a guest. Peddlers, as we see with Kadir in the Waste, stay with their wagons, so I guess the Terrans get their info from peddlers, since a peddler, viewing a hold from a distance through racism-tinted glasses, might interpret the Aiel's pueblos as caves, a perspective that is communicated to both Rand and Matt in Book 4. Regardless, the information that Ingtar is relaying is knowledge that he must have gotten secondhand from someone who had seen it, because he sounds very knowledgeable and certain of himself while still obviously never having been in the Waste, unless you can actually see pueblos from the Eastern Marches. And it's just really a great bit of info that he gives us, and it really deepens the impression of the Aiel as deadly and imposing warriors. But Ingtar doesn't make it sound like they're savage, it sounds like he admires them. And because he's not using words like destroy or ravage or burn, the perception is that he feels they are noble warriors and people worthy of respect and admiration. And the last bit of preparation that I feel like RJ gives us in the Great Hunt to lay the ground before we meet an Aiel is by showing us the foregate as Rand and Loyal and Huron make their way into the city of Cairhien with Tavalin and the Cairhienan escort. Tavalin is complaining about all of the foregaters, and he says they shouldn't be here, and Rand is like, well, where should they be? And Huron has to tell him about the fallout of the Aiel War, and explain the social and economic outcome of the war for Cairhien, and how Galdrian has to buy food from other countries because none of the people will return to their farms for fear the Aiel will come back. They want to stay by a city with walls and armed forces that can potentially protect them. There is a national trauma from the war for this land in particular. So we as readers and our main characters have a vision of these relentless, sort of savage desert dwellers with this alien culture who obviously have some manner of code if they won't touch swords or kill tinkers, but they are strange and they've inflicted a trauma on Randland, killing tons of people because one asshole cut down a tree, and people fear them. Then we meet Urien inside Kinslayer's dagger. Rand and Loyal and Huron have disappeared. Perrin is now acting as a sniffer, and he's tracked the Dark Friends through the mountains and into Cairhien. And Uno approaches Ingtar and tells him there's an Aiel man in the rocks. And Basima goes to skewer him with his lance, and Ingtar's like, knock it the fuck off, yo. It says, he was a tall man with skin dark from the sun and red hair cut short except for a tail in the back that hung to his shoulders. From his soft laced knee-high boots to the cloth wrapped loosely around his neck, his clothes were all in shades of brown and gray that would blend into rock or earth. The end of a short horned bow peeked over his shoulder, and a quiver bristled with arrows at his belt at one side. A long knife hung at the other. In his left hand he gripped a round-hide buckler and 3 short spears, no more than half as long as he was tall, with points fully as long as those of the shiner and lances. "I have no pipers to play the tune," the man announced with a smile, "but if you wish the dance—" He did not change his stance, but Perrin caught a sudden air of readiness. "My name is Urien, of the 2 Spires Sept of the Rain Aiel. I am a red shield. Remember me." Ingtar dismounted and walked forward, removing his helmet. Perrin hesitated only a moment before climbing down to join him. He could not miss the chance to see an Aiel close up. Acting like a black-veiled Aiel, in story after story Aiel were as deadly and dangerous as Trollocs. Some even said they were all Dark Friends, but Urien's smile somehow did not look dangerous despite the fact that he seemed poised to leap. His eyes were blue. "He looks like Rand." Perrin looked around to see that Matt had joined them. "Maybe Ingtar's right," Matt added quietly. "Maybe Rand is an Aiel." Perrin nodded. "But it doesn't change anything." "No, it doesn't." Matt sounded as if he were talking about something beside what Perrin meant. "We are both far from our homes," Ingtar said to the Aiel, "and we at least have come for other things than fighting." Perrin revised his opinion of Urien's smile. The man actually looked disappointed. "As you wish it, Shinerin." Urien turned to Varen, just getting down off her horse, and made an odd bow, digging the points of his spears into the ground and extending his right hand, palm up. His voice became respectful. "Wise one, my water is yours." Varen handed her reins to one of the soldiers. She studied the Aiel as she came closer. "Why do you call me that? Do you take me for an Aiel?" "No, wise one, but you have the look of those who have made the journey to Rhuidean and survived. The years do not touch the wise ones in the same way as other women or as they touch men." An excited look appeared on the Aes Sedai's face, but Ingtar spoke impatiently. "We are following Dark Friends and Trollocs, Urien. Have you seen any sign of them?" "Trollocs? Here?" Urien's eyes brightened. "It is one of the signs the prophecies speak of. When the Trollocs come out of the Blight again, we will leave the Threefold Land and take back our places of old." There was muttering from the mounted Shinerans. Urien eyed them with a pride that made him seem to be looking down from a height. "The Threefold Land?" Matt said. Perrin thought he looked still paler. Not sick exactly, but as if he had been out of the sun too long. "You call it the Waste," Urien said. "To us it is the Threefold Land, a shaping stone to make us, a testing ground to prove our worth, and a punishment for the sin." "What sin?" Matt asked. Perrin caught his breath, waiting for the spears in Urien's hand to flash. The Aiel shrugged. "So long ago it was that none remember, except the wise ones and the clan chiefs, and they will not speak of it. It must have been a very great sin if they cannot bring themselves to tell us, but the Creator punishes us well." "Trollocs," Ingtar persisted. "Have you seen Trollocs?" Urien shook his head. "I would have killed them if I had, but I have seen nothing but the rocks in the sky." Ingtar shook his head, losing interest, but Varen spoke, sharp concentration in her voice. "This Rhuidean, what is it? Where is it? How are the girls chosen to go?" Urien's face went flat, his eyes hooded. "I cannot speak of it, wise one." In spite of himself, Perrin's hand gripped his axe. There was that in Urien's voice. Ingtar had also set himself, ready to reach for his sword, and there was a stir among the mounted men. But Varen stepped up to the Aiel until she was almost touching his chest and looked up into his face. "I am not a wise one as you know them, Urien," she said insistently. "I am Aes Sedai. Tell me what you can say of Rhuidean." The man, who had been ready to face 20 men, now looked as if he wished for an escape from this one plump woman with graying hair. "I can tell you only what is known to all. Rhuidean lies in the lands of the Gen Aiel, the 13th clan. I cannot speak of them except to name them. None may go there save women who wish to become wise ones or men who wish to be clan chiefs. Perhaps the Gen Aiel choose among them. I do not know. Many go, few return, and those are marked as what they are, wise ones or clan chiefs. No more can I say, Aes Sedai. No more." Varen continued to look up at him, pursing her lips. Urien looked at the sky as though he was trying to remember it. "Will you slay me now, Aes Sedai?" She blinked. "What?" "Will you slay me now?" One of the old prophecies says that if we ever fail the Aes Sedai again, they will slay us. I know your power is greater than that of the wise ones." The Aiel laughed suddenly, mirthlessly. There was a wild light in his eyes. "Bring your lightnings, Aes Sedai. I will dance with them." The Aiel thought he was going to die, and he was not afraid. Perrin realized his mouth was open and closed it with a snap. "What I would not give," Farron murmured, gazing up at Urien, "to have you in the White Tower. I'm just willing to talk." "Oh, be still, man. I won't harm you unless you mean to harm me with your talk of dancing." And a little bit further it says, "Why are you here, so far from your own lands?" she asked. "Why did you come to us? You could have remained in the rocks, and we would never have known you were there." The Aiel hesitated, and she added, "Tell only what you were willing to say. I do not know what your wise ones do, but I'll not harm you or try to force you." "So the wise ones say," Urien said dryly, "yet even a clan chief must have a strong belly to avoid doing as they want." He seemed to be picking his words carefully. "I searched for someone, a man." His eye ran across Perrin, Matt, the Shinrans, dismissing them all. "He who comes with the dawn. It is said there will be great signs and portents of his coming. I saw that you were from Shinar by your escort's armor, and you had the look of a wise one, so I thought you might have word of great events, the events that might herald him." "A man?" Farron's voice was soft, but her eyes were as sharp as daggers. "What are these signs?" Urien shook his head. "It is said we will know them when we hear of them, as we will know him when we see him, for he will be marked. He will come from the west, beyond the spine of the world, but be of our blood. He will go to Rhuidean and lead us out of the Threefold Land." RJ teaches us an enormous amount about the Aiel in this first encounter, from their clothes and accoutrements to how they identify themselves, with no last names, just, "I'm so-and-so from this sept and this clan, and I'm, a red shield, like I'm a screaming eagle, or a mountaineer, or a lava dog." Urien is calm and well-spoken. He speaks like someone who is obviously literate and educated. He would happily have fought the Shinrans. He would have died, but he would have earned so much So had they chosen to fight, it would have been a wonderful death. And we see that a Borderlander is much more prone to resort to violence here. Massima is immediately like, violence is the answer. But Urien is kind of like, I don't have any pipers. I didn't really come prepared here, but if you guys want to fight, I'm down. I have more important things to do, but if fighting is going to be what happens, okay, and it would be a fucking kick-ass death, because how many of you can I take out before you kill me? We get our first mention of Wise Ones and Rhuidean, and it sounds like originally RJ may have intended agelessness to be purely caused by use of the One Power, because Urien says that the years don't touch Wise Ones the way that they do normal women or men, but later on we learn that, people who use the One Power slow, but the Wise Ones still look like normal women. And it's not a big deal that it changed. It seems like he realized, okay, it makes more sense that swearing on the oath rod would cause the agelessness, and hey, maybe it has some negative effect as well, and that will work better to distinguish Aes Sedai from other female channelers. And it also shows that Wise Ones are quite distinct from Aes Sedai, because for them, surviving Rhuidean is what matters, not whether or not you can channel. We first hear about the Threefold Land in this bit, and the sin, and Urien's casual attitude is very telling when he gets asked what's the sin, and he has no idea. It's like they have vague legends, but no background information about what it actually is, even though the truth is available to them. Their leaders possess the knowledge. Their leaders know exactly what's sin. They know how they ended up in the Threefold Land. They have all of the answers. And yet they leave their people fumbling around in ignorance with the non-answer of, we failed the Aes Sedai in some terrible way. We don't know what's sin, but, whatever, and leave them to tell themselves the reasons why, just as they must tell themselves why they hate the Tinkers. We don't know why, but we hate them, so we must hate them because they're cowards and they don't fight, and that makes them the cursed lost ones. We don't know what they lost, but we do know that we hate them, and we don't think too hard about it because our Wise Ones and clan chiefs encourage our contempt for them without ever saying why. RJ also shows us the Aiel awe and fear of Aes Sedai, while using Varen's curiosity to highlight Rhuidean. The minute that Urien hears that Varen is Aes Sedai, not just a Wise One, he's like, shit, instant anxiety. And then, rather than having some kind of contrived way to emphasize Rhuidean, she's like, Rhuidean, what's that? Tell us more about Rhuidean. And so we can get Rhuidean, and know it's important, and then hear, oh, but it's secret. Oh, but I can't tell you about it. And then, obviously, you want to know more, because secrets stress importance and also stoke curiosity. And we get the first mention of he who comes with the dawn and the gen. Urien thinks Varen will kill him for failing because he can't tell her more. He doesn't even know that the supposed sin that they've been punished for is the failure of the Aes Sedai. He knows that they failed the Aes Sedai in some way, and if they fail again, they'll die. He knows they were sent to the Threefold Land because of a sin, but he doesn't connect the two and realize that the sin was that they failed the Aes Sedai. RJ builds Aiel culture and gives us a view of their world and allows us to know so much about them in this short interaction with Urien. It's really great. He shows that there's a softness to this warrior and a sense of wonder. He doesn't seem savage at all. He seems intelligent, he has pride, but also a respectful humility. Urien as a character is not important. We see him again, but he's insignificant when you see him, like guarding a tent or something. But as an intro to Aiel culture, he's terrific. We meet more Aiel besides Urien in the Great Hunt. Rand has his first encounter with them, in Steading Sofu, with maidens who are trading for sung wood. It says, Rand studied the Aiel with an uneasy curiosity. They were what too many people had tried to tell him he was. 2 of the women were mature, the other little more than a girl, but all 3 were tall for women. Their short-cut hair ranged from a reddish-brown to almost golden, with a narrow, shoulder-length tail left long at the back. They wore loose breeches tucked into soft boots, and all their clothes were some shade of brown or gray or green. He thought the garments would fade into rock or woods almost as well as a warder's cloak. Short bows poked over their shoulders, quivers and long knives hung at their belts, and each carried a small round shield of hide and a cluster of spears with short shafts and long points. Even the youngest moved with a grace that suggested she knew how to use the weapons she carried. Abruptly the women became aware of the other humans. They seemed as startled at being startled as they did at the sight of Rand and the others, but they moved like lightning. The youngest one shouted, "Shinerans!" and turned to set the bowl carefully behind her. The other 2 quickly lifted brown cloths from around their shoulders, wrapping them around their heads instead. The older women were raising black veils across their faces, hiding everything but their eyes, and the youngest straightened to imitate them. Crouching low, they advanced at a deliberate pace, shields held forward with their clusters of spears, except for the one each woman held ready in her other hand. So if these maidens are startled at being startled, it's like the steading has lulled them from their standard state of hypervigilance, and that's kind of cool. An Ogier comes out and he interrupts this brewing fight. He's pissed about it. He kind of yells at them, and the maidens are really embarrassed about it. And it's like a savage who ravages and burns and pillages is synonymous with pitilessness and lack of restraint. Yet through actions, RJ shows Aiel culture to have rules. The Ogier who breaks it up has come to take Varen to talk to the elders, and he's like, "Yo, what are you doing? What about the pact?" And they unveil their faces, and it's mentioned that they do it so quickly that it's like they're almost trying to pretend that they weren't covered to begin with, which is a very Ji'ito thing to do. So Varen gets taken away, and it says, Rand and the others stood facing the 3 Aiel women uneasily. At least, Rand knew he was uneasy. Ingtar seemed steady as a stone, with no more expression than one. The Aiel might have unveiled their faces, but they still had spears in their hands, and they studied the 4 men as though trying to see inside them. Rand in particular received increasingly angry looks. He heard the youngest woman mutter, "He is wearing a sword," in tones of mingled horror and contempt. Then the 3 were leaving, stopping to retrieve the wooden bowl and looking over their shoulders at Rand and the others until they vanished among the trees. "Maidens of the Spear," Ingtar muttered. "I never thought they'd stop once they veiled their faces. Certainly not for a few words." He looked at Rand and his 2 friends. "You should see a charge by red shields or stone dogs. As easy to stop as an avalanche." "They would not break the pact once it was recalled to them," Aerith said, smiling. Watching these behaviors and interactions, RJ allows us to see instances of Ji'ito long before it is ever explained to us. The Aiel are anything but savage, and we have this assumption unraveled more in Book 3 when we meet Gaul through Perrin's eyes, and then Rourke and the other maidens through Egwene's. RJ takes advantage of having minimal page time to devote to developing the Aiel in Books 2 and 3 to paint vignettes and do beautiful character, culture, and world building. During Perrin's rescue of Gaul, Jordan uses the scene to show us how great these warriors actually are. We've heard time and again, you should see a charge by stone dogs or red shields, or that Trollocs fear them. They're such amazing warriors that Trollocs would never come 100 miles into the waste. They fought all the way to Tarvalin, and they could have kept going, but they went home after killing Layman, or Arthur Hawkwing, the best general ever, couldn't even defeat them. And then we finally get to see it. Perrin lets Gaul out of the cage, and they're standing around talking, and then White Cloaks show up and shout that the savage has escaped. And it says, as if he had all the time in the world, Gaul calmly lifted a dark cloth from his shoulders and wrapped it around his head, finishing with a thick black veil that hid his face except for his eyes. "Do you like to dance, Perrin Aybara?" he asked. With that he darted away from the cage, straight at the oncoming White Cloaks. For an instant they were caught by surprise, but an instant was apparently all the Aiel needed. He kicked the sword out of the grip of the first to reach him, then his stiffened hand struck like a dagger at the White Cloak's throat, and he slid around the soldier as he fell. The next man's arm made a loud snap as Gaul broke it. He pushed that man under the feet of a third and kicked a fourth in the face. It was like a dance, from one to the next without stopping or slowing, though the tripped fellow was climbing back to his feet and the one with the broken arm had shifted his sword. Gaul danced on in the midst of them. The fight ends really quickly, and then it says, when he finally stood, he meaning Perrin, when he finally stood, panting and nearly stunned, looking at a dozen white-cloaked men lying on the paving blocks of the square, the moon appeared not to have moved at all. Some of the men groaned, others lay silent and still. Gaul stood among them, still veiled, still empty-handed. Most of the men down were his work. Perrin wished they all were and felt ashamed. The smell of blood and death was sharp and bitter. "You do not dance the spears badly, Perrin Aybara." Head spinning, Perrin muttered, "I don't see how 12 men fought 20 of you in one, even if 2 of them are hunters." "Is that what they say?" Gaul laughed softly. "Sarian and I were careless being so long in these soft lands, and the wind was from the wrong direction, so we smelled nothing. We walked into them before we knew it. Well, Sarian is dead, and I was caged like a fool, so perhaps we paid enough." Here, we get a hint of Aiel humor. Like no wetlander would find the death of his friend and then spending subsequent days in a cage having rocks thrown at you while your enemies claimed you were 10 times your number and really it's your own fault because you were being sloppy, funny. But it is kind of funny in a darkly comic sort of way. And while Gaul isn't laughing until he cries, he's pretty amused. It's like, R.I.P. Sarian, but we were being lazy and sloppy, and we should have known better because just because these are soft lands and we're badasses doesn't mean that we can't get tripped up. And so the fact that they ended up with one of them being killed and the other captured, and then the wetlanders are saying they killed 20, is genuinely amusing to Gaul, and so that's just a subtle example of Aiel humor. Egwene, Elaine, and Nynaeve meet Maidens of the Spear as they're walking through Cairhien. Their ship gets hung up on the sunken boat, and so they get off on the Cairhien side to walk down to Jireen so they can pick up another ship. And Avienda approaches them and asks, "Hey, are you women of the White Tower? You kind of look like our wise ones." And she says, "One of us lies gravely hurt, perhaps dying. The wise ones often heal those who would surely die without them, and I have heard Aes Sedai can do more. Will you aid her?" Egwene almost shook her head in confusion. "A friend of hers is dying?" She sounds as if she is asking if we'll lend her a cup of barley flour. "I will help her if I can," Nynaeve said slowly. "I cannot make promises, Avienda. She may die despite anything I can do." "Death comes for us all," the Aiel said. "We can only choose how to face it when it comes. I will take you to her." So through dialogue, RJ is showing us this brutal pragmatism of a hard people who live in a hard land, and Avienda comes across as very grim. In fact, she seems really grim-faced until she smiles because Nynaeve tells her, "We're women of the White Tower, but whether you'd consider us wise is another matter." And when she smiles, Egwene thinks that she's actually quite lovely, but her grim expression masks it. And so she seems kind of unfeeling. But we're shown that that's not the case after Nynaeve heals her comrade. This is the first healing that these Aiel have ever seen, and it says, a short laugh burst from Avienda, a laugh almost at the edge of tears. "I have heard that a wise one in the Jagged Spire Sept is said to be able to do this and one in the Four-Hole Sept, but I always thought it was boasting." She drew a deep breath, regaining her composure. "Aes Sedai, I owe you a debt. My water is yours, and the shade of my sept-hold will welcome you. Dalen is my second sister." She saw Nynaeve's uncomprehending look and added, "She is my mother's sister's daughter. Close blood, Aes Sedai. I owe a blood debt." So Avi is joyful and grateful her cousin will live, But when Dalen is killed later on that night in the Brigands' enclosure when the Aiel break in to rescue the girls and there are 3 Fades who have come to collect them, she dies and Nynaeve is super angry about it, like I didn't heal her so she'd fucking die like this, and Aviendha reverts to a dispassionate, death comes for us all. RJ has had all our characters carry preconceptions about the Aiel, but he uses Egwene's POV to show her prejudices and assumptions during this whole interaction with the Maidens of the Spear. She has, from the moment that Aviendha popped up in front of them, embraced saidar. Elaine quickly releases it, Nynaeve never manages to embrace it, but Egwene is like, I'm not going to be stupid and assume that because somebody's a woman she's not dangerous. As Aviendha is leaving them to go see her cousin at the river, it says, Egwene finally released saidar. She suspected all 3 of the Aiel, 3 because Bane and Chiad are also there, could stab her with those spears before she could do anything about it, if that was what they wanted. But though they were wary, she did not think that they would. And what if Nynaeve can't heal their friend? I wish she would ask before she makes these decisions that involve all of us. As they headed for the trees, the Aiel scanned the land around them, as if they expected the empty landscape to hold enemies as adept at hiding as themselves. Aviendha strode ahead, and Nynaeve kept up with her. I am Elaine of House Trakand, Egwene's friend said, as if making conversation. Daughter heir to Morghese, Queen of Andor. Egwene stumbled. Light, is she mad? I know Andor fought them in the Aiel War. It might be 20 years, but they say Aiel have long memories. So Egwene worries because Aiel are wild and presumably unpredictable, in the same way that Perrin tenses when Mat asks Urien what sin, or Urien shuts down about Rhuidean. She fears that should Nynaeve not be able to heal Dalen, maybe they'll become violent. She assumes that they will see Elaine as an enemy because Andor participated in the Aiel War, and after they part ways with the maidens, Egwene says to her, My heart almost stopped when you named yourself. Weren't you afraid they might try to kill you or to take you prisoner? The Aiel War was not that long ago, and whatever they said about not harming women who don't carry spears, they looked ready enough to use those spears on anything to me. Elaine shook her head ruefully. I have just learned how much I do not know about the Aiel, but I was taught that they do not think of the Aiel War as a war at all. From the way they behave toward me, I think maybe that much of what I learned is truth, or maybe it was because they think I am Aes Sedai. I know they are strange, Elaine, but no one can call 3 years of battles anything but a war. I do not care how much they fight among themselves. A war is a war. Not to them. Thousands of Aiel crossed the spine of the world, but apparently they saw themselves more like thief-takers or headsmen come after King Laman of Cairhien for the crime of cutting down of Andorra Ladera. To the Aiel it was not a war, it was an execution. So, Jordan does a great job in this point of view of having prejudices unraveled and showing how wrong a character is about her assumptions. But I think the most important thing that we get in Book 3 as far as having assumptions challenged about the Aiel is toward the end, when Rourke and the other Aiel encounter Mat and Juilin Sandar on the rooftops as they're all scouting the stone. And he's like, Don't raise the arm cry, and says, I have respect for you, Juilin, because I'm a red shield, and I do what you thief-takers do to a certain extent. Basically, we're both in law enforcement. I get what you're doing. I understand the mentality of a person who does the job that you do. And Rourke tells him, I mean no harm to you or to the people of the city, but you will not be suffered to raise the arm cry. So if you'll keep silent, we're not going to hurt you. But if you're not going to be quiet about it, then you'll die. And Julian's like, then why are you here? And he says, the stone. Tyr was not the target, and while they take the 5th from Tyr, they're not interested in harming the people. It's not about slaughter or burning or pillaging. There's absolute restraint. They have rules. They have the capacity for mercy. There's no need to kill Juilin or to kill Mat. They have a reasoned conversation where they're like, we'll do our thing, you do your thing, and we're all cool. And it just shows that Aiel are so much more complicated than everybody assumes them to be based upon this war that has been looming in the background, saturating the culture, either because they fought in it, knew people who fought in it, suffered economic impact from it, or because they grew up hearing about it. So we get a foundational understanding of the Aiel before we go in the Shadow Rising to see them where they live, and RJ doesn't dick around once we get to the Waste. Rather than doing a soft, gradual introduction by showing us normal or standard life among Aiel in a normal or standard hold, or even showing us what a skirmish or a raid might look like, or the way that clans fight amongst each other, or competition over water, or how warrior societies in a battle avoid each other so that people of the same society won't fight even if they're in two clans fighting each other, or even just letting us see Cold Rock's hold first so we can see this is what the cities look like, the cities that Terrans referred to as caves. RJ instead brings us into the waste at the least usual place that he can do so, and a place where nobody goes unless they have specific business being there, and almost nobody ever has business there. Nobody talks about it, which suits because Rand brings change. So why should the reader's introduction to the Aiel be on Aiel terms? Why shouldn't it be like a stone in the water, Rand busting in and being like, "Yo, I'm he who comes with the dawn, and I've come to change everything and fuck shit up"? We literally pop into the waste, in territory that is technically owned by no one, for the Gen Aiel, the clan that is not, and hasn't been for thousands of years, and so it is neutral territory, in a sense, for these wetlanders to appear on, but also twice as offensive for them to be there, at least to the likes of someone like Couladin. We hear about the Gen Aiel just twice in Book 2, as Urian is explaining Rhuidean to Varen, and he's like, it's in the lands of the Gen Aiel, the clan that is not. I don't know how people get chosen to go to Rhuidean, maybe the Gen pick them. And then, at the end of Book 3, as Rourke is explaining to Matt and Moraine and the girls that actually the Aiel are the people of the dragon, it says, "When a man wishes to become a clan chief, he must go to Rhuidean, in the lands of the Gen Aiel, the clan that is not." He spoke slowly and frowned often at the red-fringed silk carpet under his soft boots, a man trying to explain what he did not wish to explain at all. Women who wish to become wise ones also make this journey, but their marking, if they are marked, is kept secret among themselves. The men who were chosen at Rhuidean, those who survive, return marked on the left arm. So, he pushed back the sleeves of his coat and shirt together to reveal his left forearm, the skin much paler than that of his hands and face. Etched into the skin as if part of it, wrapped twice around, marched the same golden scarlet form as rippled on the banner above the stone. There are only 3 mentions of the Gen in the Shadow Rising until we are standing before Rhuidean, all of them in the previous chapter as Rand is leading everybody to the portal stone in Tyr to make the trip. One is as Rand is telling Moraine he is sure that there is a stone at Rhuidean because of a book he has read by a guy named Milo. It says, Rourke had been willing to laugh at all the wrong things Milo had written about Aiel, but he had not been very forthcoming about Rhuidean. No, more than that, or less rather. The Aielmen had refused even to comment on the parts of the book supposedly about Rhuidean. Rhuidean, in the lands of the Gen Aiel, the clan which is not. That was almost the extent of what Rourke would say about it. Rhuidean was not to be spoken of. And then shortly after that, at Rand's request, Rourke sends scouts fanning out to search for the Terran portal stone. And it says, they represented almost every clan, except the Gen Aiel, of course. Rand could not get it straight whether the Gen really existed or not, since the way the Aiel mentioned them, which they seldom did, it could be either way, including some clans that had blood feuds and others that often fought each other. He had learned that much about them. Not for the first time he wondered what had held them together so far. Was it just their prophecies of the stone falling and the search for he who comes with the dawn? More than that, Rourke said, and Rand realized he had spoken his thoughts aloud. Prophecy brought us over the dragon wall, and the name that is not spoken drew us to the stone of Tyr. The name he meant was People of the Dragon, a secret name for the Aiel. Only clan chiefs and wise ones knew or used it, apparently seldom, and only with each other. For the rest, no one may shed the blood of another of the same society, of course, yet mixing Sharad with Goshian, Tardad and Nakai with Shido, even I might have danced the spears with the Shido if the wise ones had not made everyone who crossed the dragon wall swear water oaths to treat any Aiel as of the same society on this side of the mountains, even sneaking Shido. He shrugged slightly. You see, it is not easy even for me. These Shido are enemies of yours? Rand fumbled the name. In the stone, the Aiel had gone by societies, not clans. We have avoided blood feud, Rourke said, but Tardad and Shido have never been friendly. The Septs sometimes raid each other, steal goats or cattle, but the oaths have held with us all against 3 blood feuds and a dozen old hatreds between clans or Septs. It helps now that we journey toward Rhuidean, even if some will leave us before. None may shed the blood of one traveling to or from Rhuidean. The Aielman looked up at Rand, face completely expressionless. It may be that soon no one of us will shed another's blood. It was impossible to say whether he found the prospect pleasing. So this is a brilliant collection of paragraphs that imparts a lot of information. It preps us to meet the Shido shortly and gives us an idea of the sorts of treaties that bind the Aiel, the differences that divide clan and society, and it shows us the Aiel culture poised for change, just before Rand enters the glass columns and witnesses rapid generational change during an earlier time of flux and destruction. Rand's party arrives on the slopes of Chaindare and we're in Egwene's head. They pop into a tense scene, magically appearing in the middle of 3 camps, the Jindo sept of the Tardad, multiple septs of Shido, and up above, the Wise Ones, and it looks like all hell is going to break loose until the Wise Ones come running down the slopes shouting about the peace of Rhuidean. Rourke greets Amis, who tells him that her dreaming forecast that she'd meet him there today when he's all like, "Bet you're surprised to see me." And then, it says, a man had come out from each of the camps, one tall and broad-shouldered, flame-haired and still short of his middle years, the other older and darker, no less tall but more slender. They stopped a few paces to either side of Rourke and the Wise Ones. The older, leathery-faced man carried no visible weapon except his heavy-bladed belt-knife, but the other carried spears and hide buckler, and held his head high with a fiercely prideful scowl directed at Rourke. Rourke ignored him, turning to the older man. "I see you, Hairn. Has one of the Sept chiefs decided I am already dead? Who seeks to take my place?" "I see you, Rourke. No one of the Tardad has entered Rhuidean or seeks to. Amis said she would come meet you here today, and these other Wise Ones traveled with her. I brought these men of the Jindo sept to see they arrive safely." Rourke nodded solemnly. Egwene had the feeling something important had just been said or hinted at. The Wise Ones did not look at the fiery-haired man, and neither did Rourke or Hairn, but from the color rising in the fellow's cheeks they might as well have been staring at him. She glanced at Moraine and got a tiny shake of the head. The Aes Sedai did not understand either. Lon leaned down between them, speaking quietly. "A Wise One can go anywhere safely, into any hold, regardless of clan. I think not even blood feud touches a Wise One. This Hairn came to protect Rourke from whoever the other camp is, but it would not be honorable to say it." So, this is a Aiel-type game of houses. It shows Ji'ito in play, and it also paints Couladin and the Shido immediately as renegades. In the previous chapter, Rourke called them sneaking Shido. We have come to expect a certain level of conduct from Aiel, even before we have Ji'ito actually explained to us by a Wise One. We know that there are base principles that you can count on all of the Aiel adhering to, and then these assholes show that, oh, that's not necessarily the case, and while it's not honorable or it's too impolite for Hairn to flat out say, "Oh, yeah, we couldn't trust that Couladin would actually hold by the proper rules that govern our people, and so I came here because he's such a shitbag that he might actually have murdered you even at Rhuidean," he can obliquely imply it. And here, RJ is laying the ground for this subset of Aiel, the Shido, to be equally responsible for the destruction and dissolution of what it means to be Aiel. They are and will be just as guilty as Rand, and what he reveals, what he feels compelled to reveal because it is the only way to prove himself and combat Couladin's strategy of misinformation. They are as guilty as Ta'viranness, as guilty as the pattern. They're more guilty because they aren't caught up in the whims of fate. They have a choice. They can choose to use their brains and logic and to accept the truth, or to close their eyes and deliberately tell themselves, "I don't wanna." So the Wise Ones give Rand permission to go to Rhuidean, to Couladin's absolute outrage, and Mat runs up and asks to go as well, and then Couladin tries to kill him. The Wise Ones channel to throw him back, and Rand is like, "I insist that Mat will come with me." And I feel like if there weren't such a risk of bloodshed right then and there, and they weren't so desperate and hasty to get Rand into Rhuidean, and they even admit to Egwene afterwards, "We were acting in haste because we were so concerned that the Shido would don veils even here," I wonder if lacking that haste they would have refused to let Mat go. And in fact, my accompanying minisode for episode 30, the episode about Matt, I kind of examined the scene before Shane Dare and explore whether it's the actual tense political situation among the Aiel here and the fact that the Wise Ones are sort of like, okay, we have to get Rand al'Thor the fuck out of here and the fuck into Rhuidean now, and if that means that his stupid Wetlander bestie tags along, fuck it. And I think that in a calmer situation, they probably would have been like, no, 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 no. Before we actually go through the columns with Rand and get to see who the Aiel were and how they got to where they are, RJ has the Wise Ones explain Ji'ito to Egwene and Moiraine. Egwene thinks that the guy Shane are servants and asks if it's only Wise Ones who have servants, and they're like, and they get a complicated breakdown of what Guy Shane actually are and how one might come to be Guy Shane, including to the point of requesting being made one if someone touches you while you are armed, to reduce the amount of toe that you have and also lessen the amount of honor that the other person has gained. And Moiraine says, I have heard men speak of fighting the Aiel, but I have never heard of this before, certainly not of an Aiel surrendering because he was touched. It is not surrender, Ami said pointedly. It is Ji'ito. No one would ask to be made Guy Shane to a Wetlander, Melaine said. Outlanders do not know of Ji'ito. The Aiel women exchanged looks. They were uncomfortable. Why? Egwene wondered. Oh, to the Aiel, not to know Ji'ito must be like not knowing manners or not being honorable. There are honorable men and women among us, Egwene said, most of us. We know right from wrong. Of course you do, Bear murmured in a tone that said that was not the same thing at all. There's all the world of difference between knowing right from wrong and what you do with that knowledge, and the excuses you might make because you feel something is right. In Ji'ito, there are no excuses. So further on, Melaine lets slip that Moiraine must go through the apprentice rings in Rhuidean, and they're talking generally about the world of dreams, and Moiraine does this roundabout thing where she's kind of giving a breakdown of old tongue translations and telling them, well, ter'angreal means the unseen world, or the world of dreams, and blah blah blah, and she goes, and the words we have taken for common use and never think of their meanings in the old tongue. Warders are called Gaidin, which means brothers to battle. Aes Sedai meant servant of all, and Aiel, dedicated in the old tongue. Stronger than that, it implies an oath written into your bones. I have often wondered what the Aiel are dedicated to. The Wise Ones' faces had gone to iron, but Moiraine continued, and Jen Aiel, the true dedicated, but again stronger, perhaps the only true dedicated. The only true Aiel? She looked at them questioningly, just as if they did not suddenly have eyes of stone. RJ perfectly sets it up so we're aware just before Rand stripped through the columns that this is a sensitive subject. Something upsets the Wise Ones a lot about the notion of the dedicated and about the Jen. Book 4 is many people's favorite book, and for a lot of them it's because of the sequence as Rand goes through the glass columns. The Third Age has, by its very post-apocalyptic nature, lost so much history. Jordan spends 3.5 books having educated characters lament everything that's been lost, and then he sets up this beautiful sequence to provide historical vignettes, and these vignettes are not just to give information about the Aiel, but to give an unambiguous look at the past and the breaking and the age of legends, and it's just so wonderful. Because the general rule when you're reading post-apocalyptic fiction is that history is lost except for the scraps. But in this ter'angreal, we're given a device to provide full looks, real knowledge, and it's beautiful. Rhuidean is magical aside from the columns. The whole city is covered in this special shield of fog that we learn later makes it impenetrable in ter'angreal. Matt and Rand enter through the fog, and we get from Matt's point of view. The fog made an enormous hollow dome hiding the sky, its bubbling inner surface glowing in a pale, sharp blue. Rhuidean was not nearly so big as Tyr or Camelin, but the empty streets were broad as any he had ever seen, with wide strips of bare dirt down their centers as if trees had grown there once, and great fountains with statues. Huge buildings flanked the streets, odd flat-sided palaces of marble and crystal and cut glass, ascending hundreds of feet in steps or sheer walls. There was not a small building to be seen, nothing that might have been a simple tavern or an inn or a stable, only immense palaces, with gleaming columns 50 feet thick, climbing 100 paces in red or white or blue, and grand towers, fluted and spiraled, some piercing the glowing clouds above. For all its grandeur, the city had never been finished. Many of those tremendous structures ended in the saw teeth of abandoned construction. Colored glass made images in some huge windows, serenely majestic men and women 30 feet tall or more, sunrises and starry night skies. Others gaped emptily, unfinished and long deserted. No water splashed in any fountain. Silence covered the city as completely as the dome of fog. This is a city of skyscrapers and civic art, likely unfinished partly because they didn't have the proper equipment to be able to build buildings like that. In the world of the Wheel of Time, what is often called the Big White Book of Bad Art, under its passage about Rhuidean, it says that the Aiel were aided by the Aes Sedai in building the city, and it says the design was probably inspired by Aes Sedai memories of cities before the breaking, with tall buildings of many-colored shining glass reaching into the sky, exquisite statues, and wide avenues. It took me the longest time to realize. I was just sort of trying to figure out what are step-sided palaces of cut glass, and then I finally understood this last read-through. That is how someone who was from this age, like Matt, would best be able to describe what he was looking at if he was looking at a modern skyscraper. What else would they be but a palace? Which is an amazing nod to the subtleties of point of view. Robert Jordan isn't specific about how old Rhuidean is, but the Green Man in Book 1 says he hasn't rested under a Vendosora in 2,000 years, so it's at least that old. And the clues that were given in each flashback make it possible to puzzle out an approximation of the age of the city. Jordan shows us 9 point of views through 8 sets of eyes in his forward and back in time format that he uses to peel away the mystery of how the Aiel got where they are, and simultaneously give us these great peeks at history. After Rand returns from Rhuidean and shows his dragons to the gathering people and is declared the Kara Karn, he asks Rourke, does everybody see the same thing? And Rourke says, no 2 clan chiefs I have spoken with have seen through exactly the same eyes, Rand, or exactly the same things, until the sharing of water in the meeting where the agreement of Rhuidean was made. Whether it is the same for wise ones I do not know, but I suspect it is. I think it is a matter of bloodlines. I believe I saw through the eyes of my ancestors, and you yours. This does not mean that the first 2 point of views that we get, which are the agreement of Rhuidean and the water sharing, are witnessed by each person through the same eyes, but just that the significant cultural events of those first 2 point of views are experienced by all. So Rand enters the glass columns, and it says, ahead and to the right he could just see another man in the greys and browns of Aiel, stiff and statue still in the changing lights. That must be Muradin, Couladin's brother. Stiff and still, something was happening. Strangely, considering the brilliance, Rand could make out the Aiel's face clearly, eyes wide and staring, face tight, mouth quivering on the brink of a snarl. Whatever he was seeing, he did not like it, but Muradin had survived that far at least. If he could do it, Rand could. The man was 6 or 7 paces ahead of him at best. Wondering why he and Matt had not seen Muradin go in, he took another step. That's one of the things that I always really appreciate about Rand, is that he has good faith in himself. He's like, if somebody else can do this, so can I. Good for you, Rand. Anyway, it says, he rode behind a set of eyes, feeling but not controlling a body. The owner of those eyes crouched easily among boulders on a barren mountainside, beneath a sun-blasted sky, peering down at strange, half-made stone structures. No, less than half-made, that's Rhuidean, but without any fog and only just begun. Peering down contemptuously. He was Mandine, young for a sept chief at 40. Separateness faded. Acceptance came. He was Mandine. You must agree, Sieldra said, but for the moment he ignored her. The Gen had made things to drop water and spill it into great stone basins. He had fought battles over less water than one of those tanks held, with people walking by as the water was of no consequence. A strange forest of glass rose in the center of all their activity, glittering in the sun, and near it the tallest tree he had ever seen, at least 3 spans high. Their stone structures looked as if each was meant to contain an entire hold, an entire sept when done. Madness. This Reudian could not be defended. So I looked at the measurements, and 3 spans is 6 paces, which basically equals out to about 15 of our feet, or 4.5 meters, which is not very tall. I have a holly tree in my backyard, roughly that height, and it's not a very imposing tree, all things considered, so this kind of gives an idea of, okay, obviously this is a long-ass time ago for a Vendosaura to have grown to redwood-sized enormity. So this guy Mandine goes down to meet the Gen. There are 3 in particular, an old man named Derman and 2 old women named Mordain and Nerissa, and they are accompanied by these far more ancient Aes Sedai that are being carried on these wooden palanquins. It says, even trying to watch 100 possible sources of death, it was hard not to stare at the Aes Sedai as the bearers lowered their ornately carved chairs to the ground. Women with hair so white it almost seemed transparent, ageless faces with skin that looked as if the wind might tear it. He had heard that years did not touch Aes Sedai. How old must these 2 be? What had they seen? Could they remember when his great-father Comran first found Ogier Stedding in the Dragon Wall and began to trade with them? Or maybe even when Comran's great-father Roderick led the Aiel to kill the men in iron shirts who had crossed the Dragon Wall. The Wheel of Time companion says about the Gen. The Gen Aiel, aided by Aes Sedai, began construction of the city of Reudian. Before the city was completed, it became obvious that the Gen were dying out. Although the group known as Aiel flourished, the Aes Sedai realized that the prophecy from the breaking that said that the Aiel would produce someone who would defeat the Dark One would be fulfilled among those who had abandoned the way of the Leaf and the Covenant to serve the Aes Sedai. They summoned chiefs of the warrior Aiel to Reudian to learn of their past in a ter'angreal set up for that purpose. If they could survive that knowledge, they could continue and fulfill prophecy. Nothing indicates who these particular Aes Sedai are, these old women and these palanquins, just that they might be the only ones to survive the breaking. In the Big White Book of Bad Art, it suggests that even though Aes Sedai had potentially very long lifespans, because of all of the war and destruction that came from the time of madness, it was very unlikely that any Aes Sedai actually survived the entire length from the bore through the breaking, with the possible exception of the Aes Sedai who stayed with the Gen, because once they went over the Dragon Wall, the Aiel found their place of safety. The Gen, and by extension the Aes Sedai with them, became safe from everything except the dangers of the Waste, and the rest of the Aiel became safe except for those same dangers and each other. Anyway, Mandine has approached the Gen. It says, "What do you want?" Mandine demanded. "You." Derman ran his eyes across the Aiel, making that one word fit them all. "Whoever would lead among you must come to Reudian and learn where we came from and why you do not carry swords. Who cannot learn will not live." "Your wise ones have spoken to you," Mordain said, "or you would not be here. You know the cost to those who refuse." Charandon pushed his way to the front, alternately glaring at Mandine and the Gen. Mandine had put that long puckered scar down his face. They had nearly killed each other 3 times. "Just come to you," Charandon said. "Whichever of us comes to you will lead the Aiel." "No." The word came thin as a whisper, but strong enough to fill every ear. It came from the dark-eyed Aes Sedai sitting in her carved chair with a blanket across her legs as if she felt cold under the broiling sun. "That one will come later," she said. "The stone that never falls will fall to announce his coming. Of the blood, but not raised by the blood. He will come from Reudian at dawn, and tie you together with bonds you cannot break. He will take you back, and he will destroy you." So, Rand pops out of Mandine's head for a second, and he's kind of like, wow, that was weird. He moves a little bit forward, and then he's in the head of a 20-year-old dude named Roderick, who is Mandine's great-great-grandfather. Mandine was wondering as he was looking at the Aes Sedai, can they remember when his great-father, aka his grandfather, Comran, found the Ogier Stedding, or when Comran's grandfather, Roderick, killed the men in iron shirts who crossed the Dragon Wall. So we've got a 4-generation jump, and I figured out that if an average Aiel has a kid at age 20, then Comran would be born 20 years from this POV. It says Roderick is 20, and maybe he has a child fairly soon, so that's Comran's parent. Then Comran will be born in another 20-ish years if he's the firstborn, and then Mandine's parent would be born 20-ish years after that, and then Mandine 20-ish years after that, and then Mandine is 40 in his point of view. So we can say roughly that Roderick's point of view is approximately 100 to maybe 120 years before the previous one, where we see the agreement of Reudian. Roderick and his grandfather Jordan and their people are digging wells for a town for people who are the ancestors of those who will someday be the Cairhienin. And the son of the man who runs the town, a guy called Garum, comes over to tell Jordan that the Gen are moving to cross the Dragon Wall. And it says, Roderick winced, but Jordan said coolly, "What lies on the other side?" "The end of the world, for all I know," Garum replied. "I am not sure there is a way across." He hesitated. "The Gen have Aes Sedai with them. Dozens, I have heard. Does it not make you uneasy traveling close to Aes Sedai? I have heard the world was different once, but they destroyed it." The Aes Sedai made Roderick very nervous, though he kept his face blank. There were only 4, not dozens, but enough to make him remember stories that the Aiel had failed the Aes Sedai in some way that no one knew. The Aes Sedai must know. They had seldom left the Gen's wagons in the year since their arrival, but when they did, they looked at the Aiel with sad eyes. Roderick was not the only one who tried to avoid them. "We guard the Gen," Jordan said. "It is they who travel with Aes Sedai." Garum nodded as if that made a difference, then leaned forward again, lowering his voice. "My father has an Aes Sedai advisor, though he tries to keep it from the town. She says we must leave these hills and move east. She says the dry rivers will run again, and we will build a great city beside one. She says many things. I hear the Aes Sedai plan to build a city. They have found Ogier to build it for them. Ogier." Construction of the White Tower began in 98 AB, according to secondary source material. So, Roydian, assuming that Mandine's POV is 100 to 120 years after Roderick's, is built in approximately 200 to 220 AB, so it is old as fuck. It's been around nearly 3,000 years, and the Aiel have been in the waste for ages. Robert Jordan keeps checking in with Rand between the POVs. He is breezing through this ter'angreal because for him it's like an interesting anthropological study or a trip through an interactive museum. His concept of identity isn't being attacked, and every time he comes back to himself he is closer to Muradin than he was before because Couladin's brother is on the struggle bus. Rand returns to himself and notices that he's cruised along like he's on one of those slow conveyor belts, like when you go to see the Queen's Jewels in the Tower of London or something, and Muradin's belt is out of order. It says, "He was nearer still to Muradin. The Aiel's eyes shifted uneasily, and he seemed to struggle against taking another step." Rand moved forward. Squatting easily on the white-cloaked hillside, Jordan ignored the cold as he watched 5 people tramp toward him. 3 cloaked men, 2 women in bulky dresses making hard work of the snow. Winter should have been over long since, according to the old ones, but then they told stories of the seasons changing from what they had always been. They claimed the earth used to shake too, and mountains rose or sank like the water in a summer pond when you threw a rock in. Jordan did not believe it. He was 18, born in the tents, and this was the only life he had ever known, the snow, the tents, and the duty to protect. He lowered his veil and stood slowly, leaning on his long spear so as not to frighten the wagon folk, but they stopped abruptly anyway, staring at the spear, at the bow slung across his back, and the quiver at his waist. None appeared any older than himself. "You have need of us, Gen?" he called. "You name us that to mock us," a tall sharp-nosed fellow shouted back, "but it is true. We are the only true Aiel. You have given up the way." "That is a lie," Jordan snapped. "I have never held a sword." We are now in Roderick's grandfather's head. Jordan was described as a white-haired old man in the previous point of view, but old is relative when someone is 18, so he could have been as young as 50 or 60, which would make this period of time right now, if Roderick's POV was around the time the White Tower was founded in 98 AB, about 55 to 65 AB, and that works because old people would totally remember the breaking if it's only 55 to 65. And it makes sense that after major geologic upheaval there would be climate issues, particularly if there was a lot of volcanic activity. So these Gen have come to Jordan, and he takes them to his father, and it says, he was proud of his sept, nearly 200 people, largest of the 10 camps scattered north of the wagons. The Gen did not seem much impressed, though. It irritated him that there were so many more Gen than Aiel. Lewin came out of his tent, a tall, graying man with a hard face. Lewin never smiled, they said, and Jordan had certainly never seen it. Maybe he had before Jordan's mother died of a fever, but Jordan did not believe it. The yellow-haired woman, her name was Morin, told a story much as Jordan had expected. The Gen had traded with a village, a place with a log wall, and then men from the village had come in the night, taking back what had been traded for, taking more. The Gen always thought they could trust people who lived in houses, Always thought the way would protect them. The dead were listed, fathers, a mother, first brothers. The captives, first sisters, a sister-mother, a daughter. That last surprised Jordan. It was Morin who spoke bitterly of a 5-year-old daughter carried off to be raised by some other woman. Studying her more closely, he mentally added a few years to her age. "We will bring them back," Lewin promised. He took a bundle of spears handed to him and thrust them point down into the ground. "You may stay with us if you wish, so long as you are willing to defend yourselves and the rest of us. If you stay, you will never be allowed back among the wagons." The sharp-nosed fellow turned at that, and hurried back the way they had come. Lewin went on. It was seldom that only one left at this point. "Those who wish to come with us to this village take a spear. But remember, if you take the spear to use against men, you will have to stay with us." His voice and eyes were stone. "You will be dead as far as the Gen are concerned." One of the remaining men hesitated, but each finally pulled a spear from the ground. So did Morin. So this is a really subtle, clever way of showing not just how the Maidens of the Spear came to be, but how the schism between the two groups of Aiel came to be, before we actually see it from Lewin's eyes in the next point of view. Jordan's perspective is from a time when there aren't nearly enough spear wielders to really successfully protect the Gen from being victimized. They have a duty to protect, but they're not necessarily great at it. 2 generations later, in Roderick's point of view, Jordan is an old man telling the mayor's son, "We protect the Gen," and the impression is the groups are equal in number, and possibly that the numbers favor the Aiel. But when Jordan is only 18 and we're in his head, we see that the best they can do is try and right wrongs when the Gen are victimized, and maybe possibly in the moment head off attacks. And RJ here, with his mention of the first sisters and sister-mother and a daughter carried off, alludes to the horrible truth that when society breaks down, women become commodities. Next, we're in Jordan's unsmiling father Lewin's head, whose POV is arguably the saddest. It says, Lewin adjusted the dust veil across his face and peered down into the small camp where the coals of a dying fire still glowed beneath an iron cookpot. The wind brought him a smell of half-burned stew. Mounds of blankets surrounded the coals in the moonlight. There were no horses in sight. He wished he had brought some water, but only the children were allowed water except with meals. He vaguely remembered a time when there had been more water, when the days were not so hot and dusty and the wind had not blown all the time. Night was only a small relief, trading a dull, fiery red sun for cold. He wrapped himself tighter in the cape of wild goat skins he used for a blanket. His companions scrambled closer, bundled as he was, kicking rocks and muttering until he was sure they would wake the men below. He did not complain. He was no more used to this than they. Dust veils hid their faces, but he could make out who was who. Luca, with his shoulders half again as wide as anyone else's. He liked to play tricks. Garen, lanky as a stork and the best runner among the wagons. Charlin and Elijah, alike as reflections except for Charlin's habit of tilting his head when he was worried as he was now. Their sister Colleen was down in that camp, and Migran, Lewin's sister. When the girls' gathering bags were found on ground torn by a struggle, everyone else was ready to mourn and go on as they had done so many times before, even Lewin's grandfather. If Aidan had known what the 5 of them planned, he would have stopped them. All Aidan did now was mutter about keeping faith with the Aes Sedai Lewin had never seen, that and try to keep the Aiel alive. The Aiel is a people, but not any one given Aiel, not even Migran. "Therefore," Lewin whispered, "the girls are this side of the fire. I will wake them quietly, and we will sneak them away while the men sleep." His friends looked at each other, nodded. He supposed they should have made a plan before this, but all they had been able to think of was coming to get the girls, and how to leave the wagons without being seen. He had not been certain they could follow these men or find them before they reached the village they came from, a collection of rough huts where the Aiel had been driven away with stones and sticks. There would be nothing to be done if the takers got that far. "What if they do wake?" Garen asked. "I will not leave Colleen," Charlin snapped, right on top of his brother's quieter, "We are taking them back, Garen." So, their attempt to sneak the girls out doesn't go so well because their sisters are traumatized and nearly catatonic, and the shitbags who kidnapped and raped them wake up, and because the boys don't run, they choose to stand their ground in the hopes it will give the girls time to flee. There's a scuffle, and in the ensuing chaos, likely aided by the men being drunk and not expecting a fight, the boys kill them, with Charlin dying in the process. They never planned to do violence. They just planned to effect a rescue. But they were done accepting and enduring endless traumas, an endless cycle of men being murdered, and women and children being stolen, women being raped. And obviously, many other Gen come to feel the same, because by the time that Lewin has an 18-year-old son, there are close to 2,000 Aiel following and aiding the Gen. Jordan is looking at his camp and thinking that it has almost 200 people and that it's the largest of 10 camps. So if that's almost 200 and the largest of 10, maybe closer to 1,500 Aiel. But nonetheless, in the time it takes for Lewin to have an 18-year-old son, so maybe 20 to 25 years, plenty of Gen have left the way. Because what else would Lewin and his friends do but choose to stay close? They're still Aiel. They go to rescue their sisters, and they end up accidentally killing men and bringing the girls and one of their dead friends home. And then when Lewin's traumatized sister confesses that Lewin and his friends killed these bad men who took them and assaulted them, Aiden is furious, and he shuns them and tells them to leave because they are killers. So what else would they do? The four of them, Lewin, Elijah, Luca, and Garen, stay close and follow. And I doubt it took long at all, perhaps just days, for some others to join them the next time that there was an attack. The next time that bandits or brigands decided to take from the Aiel and a daughter was stolen, and some brother or father or mother thought, well, Migran and Colleen, Lewin's sister, and Charlene and Elijah's sister, they came back. They were damaged, they were traumatized, but Lewin and his friends got them back. They killed to do it, and that's terrible, but maybe it's also okay. Maybe we're tired of being victimized. Maybe it's time for us to go and take our kids back. And especially as the Aiel grew, it had to have been an easier choice to make, to leave the Gen, who Lewin may very well have named to mock them, to say, oh, they're the true Aiel, out of bitterness for being cast out, because he did not mean to kill those men. It was an accident. He was being attacked. It was self-defense. He would not have chosen to do it. It just happened in the moment. And to be ostracized for it and told, leave here, I don't want to see, the face of my son on a killer, is cruel. RJ splits the point of views that Rand goes through in the columns into 2 chapters. The 4 perspectives behind the eyes of spear holders are given to us in chapter 25, which is called The Road to the Spear. And then we get the 4 Dashane in chapter 26, The Dedicated. The next jump back in time isn't more than 10 or 15 years. We don't have an age for Lewin as he goes to rescue his sister, but he and the other boys seem late teens. As they are carrying Charlin's body back and returning with Migran and Colleen, they are referred to as young men. But the next head that we are in is Aiden's, who is Lewin's grandfather, and he is holding 5- and 6-year-old Migran and Lewin. So it is a short step in time, but a huge one in perspective, from Lewin, who chose to take action and retrieve his sister, to Aiden, who holds very strongly to the way of the leaf and the idea of enduring. We enter his head as bandits are once again stealing women, and they have just finished murdering a whole bunch of people, including his wife, Siedra, and the children's father. Some of the Dashane have had enough, and once it is safe, he is confronted by an angry group led by a guy named Solwyn, who is demanding, what are we supposed to do now? What the hell are we supposed to do now? And it says, I mean to bury our dead and go on, Solwyn. His eyes drifted back to Siedra. What else is there? Go on, Aiden. How can we go on? There are no horses. There is almost no water, no food. All we have left are wagons full of the things the Aes Sedai will never come for. What are they, Aiden? What are they that we should give our lives to haul them across the world, afraid to touch them even? We cannot go on as before. We can, Aiden shouted. We will. We have legs. We have backs. We will drag the wagons if need be. We will be faithful to our duty. He was startled to see his own brandished fist. A fist. His hand trembled as he unclenched it and put it down by his side. Solwyn stepped back and then held his ground with his companions. No, Aiden. We are supposed to find a place of safety, and some of us mean to do that. My great father used to tell me stories he heard as a boy, stories of when we lived in safety and people came to hear us sing. We mean to find a place where we can be safe and sing again. Sing? Aiden scoffed. I have heard those old stories, too, that Aiel singing was a wondrous thing, but you know those old songs no more than I do. The songs are gone, and the old days are gone. We will not give up our duty to the Aes Sedai to chase after what is lost forever. Some of us will, Aidan. The others behind Selwyn nodded. We mean to find that safe place, and the songs too. We will. A crash whipped Aidan's head around. More of Selwyn's cronies were unloading one of the wagons, and a large flat crate had fallen, half breaking open to reveal what looked like a polished doorframe of dark red stone. Other wagons were being emptied too, and by more than Selwyn's friends. At least a quarter of the people he saw were hard at work clearing wagons of everything but food or water. Do not try to stop us, Selwyn cautioned. Aidan made his fist loosen again. You are not Aiel, he said. You betray everything. Whatever you are no longer Aiel. We keep the way of the leaf as well as you, Aidan. Go! Aidan shouted. Go! You are not Aiel. You are lost. Lost! I do not want to look at you. Go! So he seems at least as angry at these fledgling Tuatha'an as he was at Lewin for killing and violating the way of the leaf. And this outrage at breaking the faith with Aes Sedai has carried for 3,000 years, so that Aiel are raised to despise these lost ones, and don't even know why, and assume it's because they despise the way of the leaf, when it's so much more simple. It's that long ago they were the first to fail the Aes Sedai. They chose to dip rather than keeping faith, to run when faced with violence rather than stoically take what comes and endure. And no one in a position of leadership tells the Aiel, yo, what their ancestors did isn't nearly as big a violation as what ours did, because ours actually abandoned the way. Back in Rand's head it says, the way of the leaf? That was no Aiel belief. He could not think clearly. He could hardly think at all. The light spun faster and faster. Beside him, Muradin's mouth was open in a soundless howl. The Aiel's eyes bulged as if witnessing the death of everything. They stepped forward together. So, Muradin is stroking out, because disbelief isn't an option here. He can't just say fake news and refuse to believe, and so it's causing him major physical distress. Next, we're in the head of Aidan's father, Jonai, who we get 2 point of views from. And I'm not sure why RJ did that, but perhaps it was because he wanted to show us a progression of the breaking from a single point of view. It says, Jonai stood at the edge of the cliff, staring out westward over the sun-sparkled water. 100 leagues in that direction lay Comel. Comel had clung to the mountains overlooking the sea. 100 leagues west, where the sea now ran. If Alnora were still alive, perhaps it would have been easier to take. Without her dreams, he scarcely knew where to go or what to do. Without her, he hardly cared to live. He felt every gray hair as he turned to trudge back to the wagons, waiting a mile away. Fewer wagons now, and showing where. Fewer people, too, a handful of thousands where there had been tens, but too many for the remaining wagons. No one rode now save children too small to walk. Aidan met him at the first wagon, a tall young man, his blue eyes too wary. Jonai always expected to see Willem if he looked around quickly enough, but Willem had been sent away, of course, years ago, when he began to channel, no matter how hard he tried to stop. The world had too many men channeling still. They had to send away boys who showed the signs. They had to. So, Aidan here is described as a tall young man, so he could be anywhere between like 18 and 30. It's awesome to see that the world is still changing. We're really in the middle of tectonic chaos, total geographic instability, and we're shown the tragedy of having to send off male channelers, because we are in the mentality of someone who grew up in a world where that is truly tragic rather than a matter of course to ostracize men who can channel, and he uses the specific word of boys to make it sadder. It makes them seem lost and vulnerable in a way male channelers are never shown to be in the world our heroes have grown up in. Archie uses his first Jonai point of view to show the beginning of the longing as Aidan leads his father to a group of Ogier. They trade news of a landscape that's in constant flux and destruction, and Jonai tells them that he doesn't know where any of the steading are. They're like, we can't find any of the steading, and if we don't find one soon, I think we're in big trouble, and it says, I cannot help you, Jonai said sadly. He felt a tightness in his chest. The land changed beyond knowing, changing still, so the plain traveled last year might be mountains this, the blighted lands growing, Myrdril and Trolloc still alive, people stealing, people with faces like animals, people who did not recognize Dashane or know them. He could barely breathe. The Ogier lost, the Aiel lost, everything lost. The tightness broke in pain, and he sank to his knees, doubled over, clutching his chest. A fist held his heart, squeezing. Aidan knelt beside him worriedly. Father, what is it? What is the matter? What can I do? Jonai managed to seize his son's frayed collar and pull his face close. "Take the people south." He had to force the words out between spasms that seemed to be ripping his heart out. "Father, you were the one who— Listen, listen! Take them south. Take the Aiel to safety. Keep the covenant. Guard what the Aes Sedai gave us until they come for it. The way of the leaf, you must." He had tried. Celinda Sedai must understand that. He had tried. And this gives some insight into Aiden. If his dad was the true leader, the one that he depended on and that everybody depended on, the one that was given the actual task as we see in the next point of view, having him keel over like that sucks. Aiden is young and Jonai is not, so losing that stability when everything is already so unstable, it has to feel like it is all spun out of control. And so I can see Aiden struggling with this lack of control and weighed down by his trauma in such a way where your father keels over dead and with his last breath exhorts you to keep the faith and hold to the way of the leap and be responsible for all the people. And so it's understandable that he would fear having Lewin poison those people around him because he had killed, and feeling he had no choice but to drive Lewin away. In the next point of view, Jonai is 63 and Aiden is 10. It says he's 10 as they're rolling out of the city and the breaking is in full swing. It says, Jonai hurried down the empty streets, trying not to look at shattered buildings and dead chora trees. All dead. At least the last of the long-abandoned Joe cars had been hauled away. Aftershocks still troubled the ground beneath his feet. He wore his work clothes, his cadden sore, of course, though the work he had been given was nothing he had been trained for. He was 63, in the prime of life, not yet old enough for gray hairs, but he felt a tired old man. No one questioned his entering the hall of the servants. There was no one at the great columned entrance to question anyone or give greeting. Plenty of people darted about inside, arms filled with papers or boxes, eyes anxious, but none so much as looked at him. There was a feel of panic about them, and it grew by increments every time the ground shook. We don't yet know how long the breaking has been going on, but the mention of long-abandoned Joe cars and all of the dead trees is telling. With all of the seismic activity, roads would fairly quickly have become unusable, and I appreciate this small detail because nothing quite says apocalypse like rusted-out cars lining the road, and yet having infrastructure where they finally managed to tow them away is like, it's a nice little detail. Jonai goes to a conference room, and it says, half a dozen Aes Sedai stood around the long table, arguing, apparently not noticing when the building trembled. They were all women. He shivered, wondering if men would ever stand in a meeting such as this again. When he saw what was on the table, the shiver became a shudder. A crystal sword, perhaps an object of the power, perhaps only an ornament, he had no way of telling, held down the dragon banner of Luce Theron Kinslayer, spread out like a tablecloth and spilling onto the floor. His heart clenched. What was that doing here? Why had it not been destroyed in memory of the cursed man as well? What good is your foretelling, Osel was almost shouting, if you cannot tell us when? Her long black hair swayed as she shook with anger. The world rests on this, the future, the wheel itself. Dark-eyed Deendra faced her with a more usual calm. I am not the creator. I can only tell you what I foretell. Peace, sisters. Celinda was the calmest of them all. Her old-fashioned streath gown only a pale blue mist. The sun-red hair falling to her waist was nearly the color of his own. His great father had served her as a young man, but she looked younger than he. She was Aes Sedai. The time for contention among ourselves is past. Jarek and Haindar will both be here by tomorrow. So preparation is being made to create the Stone of Tyr and then the Eye of the World, and the Green Man is waiting to do them a solid and go stand guard on the Eye. And this argument that they're having about the foretelling, I always assumed to be merely, I foretell that Luce Theron will be born again, and we've got to stash Kalendor in the banner. The Wheel of Time Companion says under the Dashane entry, the Aes Sedai realized that the Dashane would be slaughtered uselessly if they remained in the cities. They devised a great task worthy of the Dashane. They were given precious ter'angreal and ter'angreal and told to take them all to a place of safety, far away from Paradisen. And I always thought that that was it. It wasn't until this time through that I realized it was meant to keep them together so they'd retain order and a sense of purpose, because the foretelling said specifically that the Dragon Reborn would come to the Aiel. It wasn't just that the dragon is going to be reborn at some point and we have to put these artifacts here and get them all ready, but that the dragon will be reborn among the Aiel. Celinda tells Jonai, The Dashane have a part yet to play if Deendra could only see far enough to say what. In any case, I mean to save something here, and that something is you. As you say, he said reluctantly, we will care for what you have given into our charge until you want them again. Of course, the things we gave you. She smiled at him and loosened her grip, smoothing his hair once more before folding her hands. You will carry the things to safety, Jonai. Keep moving, always moving, until you find a place of safety where no one can harm you. As you say, Aes Sedai. What of Kuman, Jonai? Has he calmed? He did not know any way but to tell her. He would rather have bitten his tongue out. My father is hiding somewhere in the city. He tried to talk us into resisting. He would not listen, Aes Sedai. He would not listen. He found an old shock lance somewhere. He could not go on. He expected her to be angry, but her eyes glistened with tears. Keep the covenant, Jonai. If the Dashane lose everything else, see they keep the way of the leaf. Promise me. Of course, Aes Sedai, he said, shocked. The covenant was the Aiel, and the Aiel were the covenant. To abandon the way would be to abandon what they were. Kuman was an aberration. He had been strange since he was a boy, it was said. Hardly Aiel at all, though no one knew why. And next, we're in Kuman's head, so we can see why he's not quite right. He's 16, so if Jonai is 63, in the previous point of view, it has to have been at least 63 years, and probably a bit more. He probably didn't have a kid right at 16. This is the day of the strike on Shale Ghul. Lews Therin and the 100 companions go insane immediately and start breaking the world. So at the time that the Aes Sedai are giving Jonai and the rest of the Dashane the task of bringing the ter'angreal out, and the aftershocks are happening, the world's been breaking for quite some time. Secondary source material suggests that the breaking of the world lasted between approximately 240 and 340 years, depending on how you look at it, including the climate change after the fact, which we saw through Lewin's eyes with the endless drought and lack of water, and from Jordan's, who was living in a time where it was just snow. But Kuman is planning on doing seed singing. He is 16 and old enough to sing, and it says because he sees soldiers lining the way. The soldiers fascinated him, men in ogier, the way a colorful poisonous snake might. They killed. His father's great-father, Charn, claimed there had been no soldiers once, but Kuman did not believe it. If there were no soldiers, who would stop the Night Riders and the Trollocs from coming to kill everyone? Of course, Charn claimed there had not been any Myrddraal or Trollocs then either, no Forsaken, no Shadowrot. He had many stories he claimed were from a time before soldiers and Night Riders and Trollocs, when he said the Dark Lord of the Grave had been bound away and no one knew his name, or the word war. Kuman could not imagine such a world. The war had been old when he was born. He enjoyed Charn's stories even if he could not make himself believe, but some earned the old man frowns and scoldings, like when he claimed to have served one of the Forsaken once. Not just any Forsaken, but Lanfear herself. As well say he had served as Shamael. If Charn had to make up stories, Kuman wished he would say he had served Lews Therin, the great leader himself. Of course, everyone would ask why he was not serving the dragon now, but that would be better than the way things were. Kuman did not like the way citizens looked at Charn when he said that Lanfear had not always been evil. So we see the seed song, and then we learn that the boar has been sealed. And Kuman goes to find his great-grandfather and tell him the news, only to learn that admitting you used to work for a power-hungry sociopath and casually shrugging off that person's atrocities because she was always perfectly nice to you diminishes the lived experiences of others and is a dick move, and in this political climate will get you lynched, which traumatizes Kuman, obviously, in a way that Aiel have likely never been traumatized before, since they're supposed to be safe with citizens, and explains why Kuman was never quite right, and when all of the other Aiel are leaving the city, chooses to shut himself up with a shock lance, because it's gonna fuck you up when you come across your murdered great-grandfather who was killed just for talking about having worked for Lanfear. And lastly, we're in Charn's head, the day that the boar is opened, and he is walking down a futuristic street with cars and planes and plant constructs that are spreading over the street, making everybody feel super chill, and he's thinking chill, almost boring thoughts. He's thinking, yeah, I'm going to get married, and I'm going to have to change my service from Mieran Sedai and go serve another Aes Sedai, but that's okay, she's approved it, and blah, blah, blah. And he runs into a couple, quite literally, and in the middle of their conversation it says, the ground rippled under their feet, the air rippled too in spreading waves. The man looked about uncertainly, pulling his stylish fan-cloth cloak around himself and his lady so their heads seemed to float disembodied. "What is it, Dashane?" Others who had seen Charn's hair were gathering around him anxiously, asking the same questions, but he ignored them, not even thinking of whether he was being rude. He actually began to push through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the Sharam. The white sphere, 1,000 feet in diameter, floated as high above the blue and silver domes of the column Dawn. Mirren had said today was the day. She said she had found a new source for the one power. Female Aes Sedai and male would be able to tap the same source, not separate halves. What men and women could do united would be even greater now that there would be no differences, and today she and Betaman would tap it for the first time, the last time men and women would work together wielding a different power. Today, what seemed a tiny chip of white spun away from the Sharam in a jet of black fire. It descended, deceptively slow, insignificant. Then 100 gouts spurted everywhere around the huge white sphere. The Sharam broke apart like an egg and began to drift down, falling, an obsidian inferno. Darkness spread across the sky, swallowing the sun in unnatural light, as if the light of those flames was blackness. People were screaming everywhere. With the first spurt of fire, Charn broke into a run toward the column Dawn, but he knew he was too late. In a lot of ways, this is the best scene, because it's one that it takes rereads to really figure it out. Rand gives you a hand by, after the fact, asking the question, did I really see the hole bored into the Dark One's prison? But it takes later learning about the true power and getting point of views from Lanfear and from Masana, who also wanted to be a researcher at the column Dawn, to really get the full effect. The whole sequence of going through the columns is beautifully informative. It does history development and world building and shows cultural evolution on multiple levels, and for Rand it was an awesome and enlightening experience, and emotionally impactful but not gutting the way it seems to be for most Aiel. It's said that women are more likely to survive their trip through the columns than the men are, likely because Wise One training forces you to see the world in shades of gray, and to acknowledge that the pattern does not see Ji'ito. Men are thrown to the wolves, and the ones who survive are the ones who are not ruled by their feelings, who can set those feelings aside and be a little more flexible in their sense of identity, or have a little bit more empathy, and maybe not take the whole thing so fucking personally. Those are the type of people who survive. As Rand walks back from Rhuidean at dawn, it says, "The rising sun behind and the Aiel ahead, dawn and the Aiel, he who comes with the dawn." That Aes Sedai he had seen or dreamed he had seen before Rhuidean, she had spoken as if she had the foretelling. He will bind you together. He will take you back and destroy you. Words delivered like prophecy. Destroy them. Prophecy said he would break the world again. The idea horrified him. Perhaps he could escape that part at least, but war, death, and destruction already welled up in his footsteps. Tyr was the first place in what seemed a very long time where he had not left chaos behind, men dying and villages burning. He found himself wishing he could climb on Jaden and run as fast as the stallion could carry him. It was not the first time, but I can't run, he thought. I have to do it because there isn't anybody else who can. I do it or the Dark One wins. A hard bargain, but the only one there was. But why would I destroy the Aiel? How? That last thought chilled him. It was too much like accepting that he would, that he should. He did not want to harm the Aiel. Light, he said harshly. I don't want to destroy anybody. His mouth felt lined with dust again. Matt glanced at him silently, a wary look. I am not mad yet, Rand thought grimly. Upslope, the Aiel were stirring in the 3 camps. The cold fact was he needed them. That was why he had begun to contemplate this back when he first discovered that the Dragon Reborn and he who comes with the dawn might well be one and the same. He needed people he could trust, people who followed from something besides fear of him or greed for power, people who did not mean to use him for their own ends. He had done what was required, and now he would use them, because he had to. Couladin is outraged that Rand has accepted and given permission to go to Rhuidean, but because Rand is a soft wetlander, he's like, well, he's doomed to die. You say that he's one of us, so be it, but Rhuidean's gonna kill him. When truthfully, he who comes with the dawn needed to be a wetlander to be guaranteed survival, because he has no stake in Aiel identity. It's less stress on him, less even than the most flexible clan chiefs and wise ones who are capable of seeing shades of gray and are adaptable. The original plan that Rand has is to wait until all of the clans are gathered at Ter'angreal for Rand to talk to them. He travels with the Tardad and the peddlers and Shido tagging along to Cold Rock's hold, and he's going to chill there for a month. And the Wise Ones have been spending the whole trip from Rhuidean to Cold Rocks talking to the Wise Ones of other clans in their dreams and basically being like, hey, all of the chiefs need to come to Ter'angreal. And Couladin fucks it up. He follows them to Cold Rock's hold, and at some point along the way, Asmodean laser engraves 2 dragons on him. Luckily for him, Lanfear dragged the artistic Forsaken into the waste with her to masquerade as Gleeman. The Shido peace out from Cold Rocks in the middle of the night and head to Ter'angreal, and when Rand realizes that, he chooses to follow, despite the fact that it will dishonor some of the chiefs. Rourke is like, yo, it's gonna dishonor them, and Rand is like, sucks to suck. I'll tell them I'm sorry, but I cannot let him get there ahead of me, because fuckery will abound. And so they follow, and they make it not far behind. And it says, clusters of Aiel dotted the slopes, heads and faces bare, many more clusters than there were clans. The Tardad who had come with the Sept chiefs peeled away toward one or another of those. According to Rourke, grouping by society rather than clan was an aid to keeping peace. Only his red shields and the maidens continued on with Rand and the Tardad chiefs. The Sept chiefs of the other clans all sat by clan, cross-legged before a deep ledge beneath the curling overhang. 6 small knots, one of maidens, stood between the Sept chiefs and the ledge. Supposedly these were the Aiel who had come for the honor of clan chiefs. 6, although only 5 clans were represented. Savannah would have the maidens, though Avienda had been quick to point out that Savannah had never been Farder Ice Mai. But the extra, 11 men in that, not 10. Even seeing only the back of a flame-haired head, Rand was sure it was Couladin. On the ledge itself stood a golden-haired woman in as much jewelry as the woman back at the fair tents, grey shawl draped over her arms. Savannah, of course, and 4 clan chiefs, none armed save for his long belt knife, and one, the tallest man Rand had ever seen. Aiel of the Goshian Isle, by the descriptions Rourke had given. The fellow had to be at least a hand taller than Rourke himself. Savannah was speaking, and some trick of the canyon's shape carried her words clearly throughout. Allow him to speak! Her voice was tight and angry. Head high and back straight, she tried to dominate the ledge by force of will. I demand it as my right. Until a new chief is chosen, I stand for Suladric and the Shido. I demand my right. You stand for Suladric until a new chief is chosen, Roof Mistress. The white-haired man who spoke in irascible tones was Han, clan chief of the Tomanel. With a face like dark wrinkled leather, he would have been taller than average in the 2 rivers. For an Aiel he was short, if stocky. I have no doubt you know the rights of a Roof Mistress well, but perhaps not so well those of a clan chief. Only one who has entered Rhuidean may speak here, and you, who stand in Suladric's place. Han did not sound happy about that, but then he sounded as if he were seldom happy. But the Dreamwalkers have told our wise ones Couladin was refused the right to enter Rhuidean. Couladin shouted something, plainly furious, yet indistinct. Apparently the canyon's trick only worked from the ledge, but Aram of the Shireen, his own bright red hair nearly half white, cut him off sharply. Have you no respect for custom and law, Shido? Have you no honor? Stand silent here. So then Rand and Rourke ride to the ledge, and Rand pulls this boss-ass power move by stepping straight from his saddle onto it, which immediately causes a stir. You know, the crowd is already curious, just having wetlanders on horses there, and then they watch that, and it says, "What do you do, Rourke?" Han demanded, scowling, "bringing this wetlander here. If you will not kill him, at least send him down from standing like a chief." "This man, Rand al'Thor, has come to speak to the chiefs of the clans. Did not the Dreamwalkers tell you that he would come with me?" Rourke's words brought a louder murmur from the listeners. "Valaine told me many things, Rourke," Bael said slowly, frowning at Rand, "that he who comes with the dawn had come out of Rhuidean. You cannot mean that this man—" He trailed off in disbelief. "If this wetlander can speak," Savannah said quickly, "so may Couladin." She lifted a smooth hand, and Couladin scrambled onto the ledge, face an angry red. Han rounded on him. "Stand down, Couladin. It is bad enough that Rourke violates custom without you doing it as well." "It is time to be done with worn-out customs," the fiery-haired Shido shouted, stripping off his gray and brown coat. There was no need for shouting. His words echoed across the canyon, but he did not lower his voice. "I am he who comes with the dawn." So he sticks his hands in the air, and voila, there are his laser-engraved dragons on his arms, and seeing an Aiel man proclaim himself the Karakarn gets all of these Aiel pumped. They're leaping to their feet, they're shouting, they're like, woo! And then he's like, I'm gonna bring change, I bring new days, we're gonna go over the Dragon Wall, we're gonna fucking kick ass and take all the wealth and steal everything. And it says, Rand let the man's tirade wash over him. Of things possible, he had never suspected this. How? The word kept sliding through his head, yet he could not believe how composed he was. Slowly he took off his coat, hesitating a moment before fishing the ter'angreal from his pocket. Sticking it into the waistband of his breeches, he dropped the coat and walked to the front of the ledge, calmly undoing the laces of his sleeves. They slid down as he raised his arms above his head. It took a moment for the assembled Aiel to notice the dragons wrapped around his arms, too, shining in the sunlight. Their hush came by increments, but it was total. Savannah's mouth dropped open. She had not known of this. Obviously, Couladin had not thought Rand would follow so quickly, had not told her another bore the markings, too. How? The man must have believed he would have time. Once he had established himself, Rand could be dismissed as a fraud. Light, how? If the roof mistress of Camarda Hold was stunned now, so were the clan chiefs, save only Rourke. 2 men, marked as prophecy said only one could be. Couladin ranted on, waving his arms to make sure all saw. We'll not stop with the lands of the Oathbreakers. We will take all the lands to the Arth Ocean. The Wetlanders cannot stand against... Suddenly he became aware of the silence where eager cries had been. He knew what had caused it. Without turning to look at Rand, he shouted, Wetlander! Look at his clothes! A Wetlander! A Wetlander, Rand agreed. He did not raise his voice, but the canyon carried it to everyone. The Shido looked startled for a moment, then grinned triumphantly until Rand went on. What does the prophecy of Rhuidean say? Born of the blood. My mother was Shail, a maiden of the Chumai Tardad. Who was she really? Where did she come from? My father was Janduin of the Iron Mountain Sept, clan chief of the Tardad. My father's Tam Althor. He found me, raised me, loved me. I wish I could have known you, Janduin, but Tam is my father. Born of the blood, but raised by those not of the blood. Where did the wise ones send to look for me? Into the holds of the threefold land? They sent across the Dragon Wall where I was raised, according to the prophecy. Bael and the other 3 nodded slowly but reluctantly. There was still the matter of Couladin also bearing the dragons, and doubtless they would rather have one of their own. Savannah's face had firmed. No matter who bore the real markings, there was no doubt whom she supported. Couladin's confidence never wavered. He sneered openly at Rand, the first time he had even looked at him. How long since the prophecy of Rhuidean was first spoken? He still seemed to think he had to shout. Who can say how much the words have changed? My mother was Far Ice Mai before she gave up the spear. How much has the rest changed, or been changed? And while that is a fair point, this dude didn't go to Rhuidean, which Rourke points out. He points out that the wise ones refused to let him go, and it says, And why did they refuse me? Couladin snarled. Because the Aes Sedai told them to. Rourke does not tell you that one of the Aes Sedai went down from Chaindair with this Wetlander. That is how he returned with the dragons, by Aes Sedai witchery. My brother Muradin died below Chaindair, murdered by this Wetlander in the Aes Sedai moraine, and the wise ones doing Aes Sedai bidding let them walk free. When night came, I went to Rhuidean. I did not reveal myself until now, because this is the proper place for the Karakarn to show himself. I am the Karakarn. Lies, touched with just enough flecks of truth. The man was all victorious confidence, sure he had an answer for everything. And Rand's like, okay, what did you see there, chicken shit? I saw history inside sparkly columns and a big tall tree. I'm not scared to say what I saw. What about you, chicken shit? And it says, uncertain looks passed between Bael and Aram, Jaren and Han. We must go apart for this, Han muttered. Couladin did not seem to realize he had lost his advantage with the 4, but Savannah did. Rourke has told him these things, she spat. One of Rourke's wives is a dreamwalker, one of those who aids the Aes Sedai. Rourke has told him. Rourke would not, Han snapped at her. He is clan chief and a man of honor. Do not speak of what you do not know, Savannah. I am not afraid, Couladin shouted. No man can call me afraid. I too saw with my ancestors' eyes. I saw our coming to the threefold land. I saw our glory, the glory I will bring back to us. I saw the Age of Legends, Rand announced, and the beginning of the Aiel journey to the threefold land. Rourke caught his arm, but he shook the clan chief off. This moment had been fated since the Aiel gathered before Rhuidean the first time. I saw the Aiel when they were called the Dashane Aiel, and followed the way of the leaf. No! The shout rose from out in the canyon and spread in a roar. No! No! from thousands of throats. Spear points shaken in the air caught the sunlight. Even some of the Tardad Sept chiefs were shouting. Adolin stared up at Rand, stricken. Matt shouted something at Rand, lost in the thunder, waving urgently for him to take his saddle. Liar! The canyon shape carried Couladin's bellow, wrath mixed with triumph, over the shouts of the gathering. Shaking her head frantically, Savannah reached for him. She must at least have suspected now that he was the fake, yet if she could keep him quiet they might yet pull it off. As Rand hoped, Couladin pushed her away. The man knew Rand had been to Roydian. He could not possibly believe half of his own story, but neither could he believe this. He proves himself a fraud from his own mouth. We have always been warriors, always, to the beginning of time. The roar swelled, spears shaking, but Bael and Aram, Jaren and Han stood in stony silence. They knew now. Unaware of their looks, Couladin waved his dragon-wreathed arms to the assembled Aiel, exulting in the adulation. And then all 5 clan chiefs say, Rand al'Thor is he who comes with the dawn. Rand al'Thor is the Kara Karn. And Couladin tries to kill him, and everybody freaks the fuck out and starts fighting, and so Rand has to make it rain to get people to calm the fuck down. The Shido would rather ignore a truth independently confirmed by 5 clan chiefs than accept that their leader is full of shit. And others join them because it's easier to deny. They sit there and scream, no, 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 and then have multiple people say, Rand al'Thor is he who comes with the dawn. He's the Kara Karn. But they don't want to believe it. They don't want to believe it because they don't like it. They hate the idea of this being the truth. They want it to be fake news. Couladin and his clan make me think of the sort of white fundamentalist right-wing Christians who wave the American flag with one hand and the Confederate flag with the other, while insisting it's about heritage, not oppression, and how assholes like that might behave if Jesus came back as an anti-fascist trans person of color. They couldn't bear it or accept it, and no matter how much proof they were shown, or how many religious leaders came out in support and were like, this trans person of color who's all about Antifa is absolutely Jesus, they would insist that it couldn't be true. I used to think that the idea that people who go to Roydian often die because they're witnessing an unpalatable truth was ridiculous. Like, how ludicrous. Please, Jordan, couldn't you come up with something that was a little bit more believable? But after years now of watching an alarmingly large number of my fellow Americans willfully ignore easily provable facts and gobble down absurdities that are just as easily disproved, I can believe it. What the shiny columns do is not allow you to turn away from the truth, and maybe the people who have to believe the Aiel are the greatest thing ever and can never do anything wrong under Ranland's version of America stroke out because they just can't handle it. Either way, the clan chiefs and the wise ones seem to me to be derelict to continue to promote Aiel exceptionalism and encourage their loathing of tinkers and continue to build on this lie when they know that it's founded on bullshit. Even a society that has lots of internal conflict, because Aiel fight each other and disagree about things and even have blood feud between clans, can have a code of honor that rules them, laws and customs that bind everyone. But when a clan doesn't want to listen to an uncomfortable truth and doesn't want to accept it, and they're willing to push against the bounds of the code of honor and be like, you know what? We're not going to follow these rules anymore because they're not convenient, because we don't like them. We want what we want, and we don't care what's true. Everything slips at that point because it's like, what do you do with that? What do you do? And watching the Aiel break apart, watching them struggle with their sense of identity, watching huge numbers of them refuse to accept Rand, and watching the Shido corruption as they disintegrate and fall apart this read-through feels especially real and especially poignant. And I'll continue this exploration through the fires of heaven and beyond, because I have a feeling it's going to be hauntingly relevant. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Podcast of the Dragon. I put a lot of work into this one, so it took a while to get it out to you. I'll be starting the Fires of Heaven soon and taking notes for multiple episodes. If you noticed a marked lack of Forsaken discussion in this book, that's because I felt it was better to wait until we got all of Lanfear's dirty dealings in the next one, and might as well let Asmo complete his arc before we break it down. How little did we know ye. I anticipate my first episode for Book 5 to be about Forsaken fuckery. I haven't decided what this episode's accompanying minisode on Patreon is about. I'm thinking maybe some empathetic musings with some of the doomed souls in the ter'angreal, but that sounds depressing as hell. I'll give it some thought. If you'd like to support the show and have access to that or other fun content, there's a link in the show notes. There are other links to Discord and email, as well as a link to my YouTube, which you should subscribe to, and to my Twitter handle. There's also a link to Apple Podcasts. If you could review my show, I'd really appreciate it, because it will help other people find me, and so will word of mouth. So if you know anybody who likes the Wheel of Time and might be interested in a different kind of podcast, please tell them about me. My music is by Kevin MacLeod. My name is Morgan, and I'm as prone to cognitive dissonance as the next person. That said, when something is confirmed to me by 5 independent sources, especially when 2 of those sources want to kill each other, my instinct is to believe it no matter how much I dislike it.